Chapter 363. Chen Changxing's gaze pierced through the black willow forest and rested on the great Zhou cavalry in the snowy plains. He understood what Su Li had just said. Other than the demons, the people on this continent that wanted him dead the most were the people of Zhou. These great Zhou cavalry that were clearly searching everywhere for their target was clear proof, but he still felt that there were other possibilities. For example, these great Zhou cavalry had come to save them? Why do you always like to think of things in the worst possible way? Su Li listened to his question and said with a hint of mockery, because everything often develops according to people's worst assumptions. As if to prove his words, several dozen of the several hundred cavalry split off and rode towards the black willow forest. They painted a black line on the monotonous snowy plains. Arriving in front of the black willow forest, the cavalry all unsheathed their weapons from their saddles and dropped their helmets. They seemed extremely vigilant. No matter how one looked at it, these cavalry did not come to save people, but to kill. The cavalry entered the forest, and the clopping of hooves could occasionally be heard. Occasionally, there would be the sound of a black willow branch snapping. Whether it was to save people or to kill people, they did not need to hide their tracks. And if the target they were searching for was really, as the intelligence had said, a cripple, then what happened next should be extremely simple. At some point, Chen Changxing's right hand had already landed on the hilt of his dagger, ready to pull it out at any time. His body was currently very strong. Even if he had traversed 10,000 li of snowy plains, all his fatigue and hidden injuries had completely disappeared after a night's sleep on the cold calm. His true essence had gradually recovered, and even the injuries he had received in the Garden of Zhou were much better. He was confident that he could defeat or even kill all the several dozen cavalry that had entered the forest, even if these cavalry were definitely elites that had succeeded in purification. But he did not have the slightest confidence that he could silently kill these cavalry without alerting the cavalry that was currently advancing east. More importantly, these cavalry were all soldiers of the great Zhou, while he was a person of Zhou. He truly could not just suddenly kill them without asking for any reason. He did not know what he should do. He silently stared at the indistinct figures of the cavalry in the black willow forest. As those figures got closer and closer, his breathing became more and more hurried, more and more nervous. The hand that gripped the hilt of his dagger became whiter and whiter. If he allowed the situation to continue like this, it would not be long before those cavalry saw him and Su Li's figures. "Senior, let's go." He finally made his decision. Turning around, he indicated for Su Li to come closer, and then he prepared to carry Su Li and escape. Since he could no longer continue to hide, nor could he unsheath his sword to kill, he could only run. Fortunately, he now possessed an unimaginable speed, so he was confident that those cavalry would not be able to catch up in a short amount of time. As for what sort of trouble the Zhou army would bring once they discovered his and Su Li's whereabouts, he temporarily did not care about it. Su Li had no intention of leaving. He said, "Open the umbrella." Chen Changxing did not understand. He took the yellow paper umbrella and opened it. Then, according to Su Li's instructions, he poured his true essence into the handle of the umbrella. At the same time, he activated a certain mechanism on the umbrella ribs. A faintly discernible qi descended from the surface of the yellow paper umbrella. It was like a formless waterfall covering the surroundings. The cold wind was unable to blow into the yellow paper umbrella, but snow began to fall from the sky. The light snowflakes landed on the umbrella silently. Dozens of cavalrymen came to the depths of the black willow forest and stopped not far from them. Chen Changxing was very nervous. Looking at the cavalrymen that were 10 yards away, he could even clearly see the color of the eyes of the leader of the cavalry. The dozens of cavalrymen acted as if they hadn't seen anything, continuing to disperse into the black willow forest. After an unknown amount of time, Chen Changxing confirmed that the cavalrymen had already left the black willow forest. Only then did he realize that the two hands that were holding onto the handle of the umbrella and the hilt of the sword had become somewhat stiff because of his nervousness. "Close the umbrella," Su Li said. He did as he was told, and properly closed the yellow paper umbrella. He tied it to his waist and then prepared to leave. Don't be in too much of a hurry. Those cavalrymen should still be waiting outside, Su Li said again. Chen Changsheng did not question him. He once again sat down in the pile of snow by the tree. Afterwards, he looked at the yellow paper umbrella and sighed ruefully. I really didn't think that this umbrella would have such a wondrous use. The corner of Su Li's mouth perked up. Why don't you think about who I am? Chen Changsheng did not respond. He really was somewhat tired of it, and he also knew that even if he did not respond, this narcissistic senior would definitely have a way to continue the conversation for him. Just as expected, Su Li's eyebrows perked up as if he wanted to fly up. He proudly said, "This is a magical artifact that I and Old Man Tang designed together. It uses the heaven-shrouding sword as the pivot and uses countless rare materials as the body. Even meditation cultivators might not be able to see through the illusion. Don't tell me these ordinary cavalrymen want to see through my umbrella?" Chen Changsheng wanted to say something, but then hesitated. Su Li's eyebrows perked up even higher. If you have something to say, then say it. Chen Changsheng said, "Senior, this umbrella is mine." The Black Willow Forest was very quiet. The snow fell without a sound. When they had first left the hot spring and the snowy ridge, they had argued over this matter. Chen Changsheng thought about how heavily injured he was, so he did not continue. However, at this moment, he could not hold it in any longer because he believed that this umbrella had always been his. Su Li looked at him and sneered. "Do you know the origins of this umbrella?" Chen Changsheng had heard a few stories about the yellow paper umbrella from Zhuxiu. Combined with what he had seen and heard in the garden of Zhou and on the snowy plains, he basically knew everything. He nodded his head. Su Li paid no attention to him and continued to tell the story of the umbrella. In the end, he stared into Chen Changsheng's eyes and said, "I found the sword, I designed the umbrella. And in the end, you say that this umbrella is yours?" Chen Changsheng said, "But the materials for this umbrella were all found by the Tang Old Master. Back then, didn't Senior leave this umbrella in the Wenshui Tangs because you couldn't afford it?" Su Li's expression gradually grew cold. "Say that again." Chen Changsheng thought to himself that saying he couldn't afford it was indeed somewhat inaccurate. He reorganized his words and said, "Wasn't it because you, Senior, reneged on the debt that the yellow paper umbrella ended up in the Wenshui Tang's hands?" Su Li was so angry that he laughed. "I am the most senior elder of Mount Li. I travel the 4 seas, raid and plunder, and commit all sorts of crimes. Do you think I lack money?" Chen Changsheng did not care that he had committed all sorts of crimes, such as raiding and plundering. He seriously explained, "But you didn't pay." Su Li realized that he had nothing to say, so he did not say anything. The atmosphere became rather awkward. Chen Changsheng hesitantly stood up and climbed onto the black willow tree to observe the movements of the great Zhou cavalry in the distance. At the same time, he blew away the heat on his face. After a while, he descended from the black willow tree and said to Su Li, "Senior, those cavalry should have really retreated." Su Li ignored him. Chen Changsheng said, "Senior, if those cavalry really did come to kill you, then do you still need to hide your tracks? You don't believe us Zhou people, but there will always be people you can trust. Just like you said before, there will be people who will come to kill you, and there will also be people who will come to save you. Although you are far from the mountain, those people who want to save you might be very close." Su Li looked into his eyes and said, "The problem is, are there more people who want to kill me, or are there more people who want to save me? Which one is more urgent?" Chen Changsheng said with some hesitation, "Senior, aren't you thinking of human nature too darkly? It's not human nature, it's the human heart. Human nature cannot be tested, and the human heart cannot be guessed. Fanatical love and loathing, in the end, are all benefits. Emperor Taizong was clearly a shameless person who killed his brother and forced his father, and Zhou Dufu was clearly a butcher who killed without counting. Why is it that in the eyes of ordinary people, there's a golden light on their bodies? It's because Emperor Taizong and Zhou Dufu brought them enough benefits. They drove the demons back to Shuilao City, allowing the humans living in the Central Plains to avoid the flames of war, to avoid being enslaved by other races. Thus, they're naturally what the hearts of the people desire. Suli looked at him and seriously asked, "And me? I live in a peaceful era without war. Other than killing a few demon generals, I haven't done too much. What have I done for the human world? What kind of benefits have I obtained for cultivators and the common people? Is it worth them traveling tens of thousands of li to help me? Is it because my path of the sword is powerful and invincible, and my bearing is free and unrestrained?" It was clearly a very serious, even very serious discussion or instruction, but because of those last two sentences, it had a different flavor. Qin Changsheng did not know how to respond at all. He asked, "Then what about the Southerners?" In ordinary people's minds, Mount Li's junior marshal Uncle Su Li was currently the strongest person in the Southern world. It was also because of his existence that the South could maintain its last dignity and pride before the flourishing Great Zhou. Of course, there are many Southerners who thank me, but there are also many Southerners who hate me. As I said a few days ago, I killed many people. Since I grew up in the South, then the majority of the people I killed were Southerners. They all had relatives, schoolmates, and descendants. So how could they like me? Of course, no matter how many people there are who hate me, they can't be the majority. Otherwise, wouldn't I become a street rat that everyone wants to beat up? The problem is that many years ago, I did something that disappointed the entire Southern world. So there are more and more people who don't like me. What thing? Qin Changsheng asked curiously. 10 years ago, the bloody case of the Orthodox Academy. You should know about it. I know. Speaking of which, is Taoist Ji really your master? Senior, actually, I really don't know about this matter. Fine, let's get back to the main topic. In short, after the case of the Orthodox Academy, the Pope was heavily injured, the army was in internal turmoil, the imperial court was in conflict, Zhou Tong was randomly killing people, the capital was in disarray, and your Zhou kingdom was in shambles. In the eyes of the Southerners, this was, without question, the best opportunity. Moreover, it has to be admitted that the longevity sect of the time was truly very strong, capable of contending with the Li Palace. And then, when the Southerners were about to act after several years of preparation, I went to the longevity sect for some reason and killed off all those elders. As a result, the matter they were preparing to do could only be left unsettled. Senior, this sort of secret is truly shocking to hear, but why do I always feel that Senior is using this method to praise himself? What's there to praise about such a tragic matter? It was very rare that Suli did not continue to praise himself. His expression was so calm that it made one's heart palpitate. See you tomorrow. Chapter 364. Suli expressionlessly said, "The Southerners' best and last chance was lost just like that. What will they thank me for? Other than thinking that I'm a madman, the people of Zhou won't thank me." Qin Changsheng thought it over, then said, "Not liking, not thanking, does not mean that they want Senior to die." Suli said, "In the blink of an eye, 10-odd years have passed. Tianhai, Old Man Yin, and that woman from Holy Maiden Peak still wholeheartedly want the confluence of North and South, but I still don't agree. If I don't agree, Mount Li won't agree, and the longevity sect won't agree. The confluence of North and South will forever be a large flat cake drawn on paper. Tell me, do these saints not want me to die?" Hearing Su Li's words, Qin Changsheng fell silent for a very long time. Thinking back to when he had just left the Garden of Zhou and the great battle array he had seen on the snowy plains, he said, "The demons also want Senior to die. Don't you think this is very absurd? Remember, the enemy of an enemy is not necessarily a friend, because there is something called benefit in the middle. If I die, the continent will be thrown into turmoil, and the Demon Lord and Tianhai are also the two most confident people in the world. They are confident that they can use the chaos to obtain what they want, so of course they want me to die." Qin Changsheng looked at Su Li and said very seriously and sincerely, "Senior, then why don't you support the confluence of North and South? No matter how you look at it, this matter is beneficial to the human race." "Do I have to do things that are beneficial to the human race?" Fine. These words are too much like the words of a great villain. I take them back. Suli looked at him and calmly said, but can you answer a question of mine? What's the difference between being ruled by Tian Hai and being ruled by the demons? Chen Changsheng really wanted to say that the difference was too great. A war between races could easily lead to the danger of extinction, while a war between humans was just a question of who lowered their heads. However, he knew that to a person like Su Li, being ruled was in itself an unacceptable situation. There truly was not much difference between the two. Senior, could it be that the world in your eyes has always been so dark? It's not dark, but colorless, cold ice. I've said it before, it's benefit. Could it be that we can't think of the world in a positive light? This was already the third time Qin Changsheng had asked a similar question. No, because such things have happened many times in the past. The so-called history is nothing more than the current evidence, and the so-called present is nothing more than the repetition of history. Suli looked at him and said, I don't want to become the second Zhou Dufu, so no matter if it's the demons or you people of Zhou, I won't believe them. The black willow forest became silent again. After a long period of silence, Chen Changsheng suddenly opened his mouth and asked, Senior, are you teaching me? From the moment they entered the stronghold, Su Li and Chen Changsheng began to converse more. Afterwards, no matter if it was the encounter with the assassins or the Great Zhou cavalry or the seemingly casual but actually rather meaningful choice of topic, they all indicated that Su Li was trying to teach Chen Changsheng a few things, how to view this world and how to continue living. Su Li looked at him and said with slight mockery, Isn't it a little too late to understand now? Rumor has it that you are well-versed in the Taoist canon, but why can't I see the slightest bit of comprehension in you? But why is that? Chen Changsheng did not care about this senior's mockery, but he was rather puzzled. He was a person of Zhou, and Su Li was a southerner. He was the founding monster of the new generation that the orthodoxy had focused on nurturing, while Su Li was the great freedom of the way of the sword. The two of them originally had no connection, and the camps they belonged to were even secretly hostile. Not to mention the terrible relationship between the Orthodox Academy and the Mount Li Sword sect, and the possible competition between him and Xioshan Jun in the past and in the future. Su Li had no reason to teach him like a teacher. Because I admire you very much. Su Li looked at him expressionlessly and said, Is this reason enough? Chen Changsheng very honestly shook his head and said, Senior, of course it's not enough. Su Li was somewhat at a loss for words. If it were any other junior who was so patiently taught by him, they would not be moved to tears. At the very least, after he had given them a reason, they would definitely not continue to pursue the matter. He looked at the clear and bright eyes of the youth and suddenly laughed. He thought to himself, that's right. If this kid wasn't this kind of person, how could he have caught my temper? Because I hope that you can live on well. The longer you live, the better, he said seriously to Chen Changsheng. Chen Changsheng was slightly startled. He thought to himself, could it be that Senior knows about my severed meridians and that I don't have long to live? Su Li's following words indicated that he did not know this secret. He said, because only by living long enough can you become strong enough. I hope that you can continue to be strong until the very end. What's the very end? The next pope. Senior hopes that I become the next pope? Correct, because if you become the pope, it's the best thing for the Southerners. Why? Because you're not willing to kill people, and even more so, you won't revel in killing people. You're very clear about everything other than life and death. I've never seen a young man at your age that doesn't care about fame and fortune. Of course, your obsession with my yellow paper umbrella sometimes makes me begin to doubt my own judgment. I don't know how Senior saw that I don't care about fame and fortune, but can I become the Pope just like this? Chen Changsheng subconsciously looked at the dusky sky, looked at the snowflakes falling from an unknown height, and said, it feels so far away. Su Li looked at him with some interest and said, could it be that you've never had this sort of awareness? Chen Changsheng withdrew his gaze and asked in a slight daze, what awareness? The Li Palace attaches so much importance to you and nurtures you, making you the youngest upper-level ethereal opening cultivator in history, the youngest principal of the Orthodox Academy. If they didn't want you to become the next pope, what did those old fellows want to do? Qin Changsheng was silent. He now knew why His Eminence Bishop Mei Lisha was so concerned about him and what the pope was thinking. After leaving the mausoleum of books, all the mysteries had long since been answered. But he had never been very clear about this matter, and subconsciously did not want to remember it. Too many things had happened in the Garden of Zhou, so much so that he believed that he had truly forgotten about this matter. Only now did Suli wake him up. He was the successor of the orthodoxy. However, his gaze still habitually fell on a place not far in front of him. He was not used to raising his head to look at the sky. Whether it was the dusky sky or the clear blue sky, the light was always so dazzling. If he returned to the capital, as the successor of the orthodoxy, he might have to directly face the divine empress dignity. This made him very uneasy. Of course, he first had to return to the capital. Today, the leader was celebrating his birthday. He only returned home after 9 o'clock. In a hurry, he wrote more than 3,000 characters. In the end, when he examined it, he discovered that the last 1,000 or so characters were completely wrong. The mistakes were shocking, so he could only delete them. I'll post this. Tomorrow, there'll be 2 chapters. Chapter 365. When I mentioned Taoist Ji, you said you didn't know anything. Was that a lie? Suli said as he looked at the expression on his face. Qin Changsheng could only remain silent, because he was not very good at lying. Suli said to himself, then just why did these old fellows push you out? Conversations often occurred, and their conclusion often did not require any answer. Qin Changsheng could not find an answer, and Suli only used a very short time to think about it. After confirming that the cavalry of the Great Zhou were truly far away, Qin Changsheng carried him on his back and passed through the black willow forest, continuing south. As they continued to walk, or perhaps run, the weather gradually warmed up, and the scenery that the two saw was getting closer and closer to the true time of day. In the capital, it should be the middle of spring, and in Mountley in the south, it should already be late spring. However, it was still rather cold here, and as far as the eye could see, they could still see the remnants of snow like stars. Fortunately, there was already some starlight green. Seeing those green sprouts that had died last year, Qin Changsheng remembered that it had already been a whole year since he had left Xining village. In this year, too many changes had occurred. Even though he was still a youth in the prime of his youth, every time he looked back, he could not help but feel some sorrow that only a middle-aged man would feel. After passing through a farmer settlement called Woolly Village, there were some changes beside the two. There was an additional carriage, and the animals pulling the carriage were 2 healthy furry deer. Qin Changsheng sat at the front of the carriage, pulling on the rope around the neck of the furry deer. From time to time, he would let out a few incomprehensible shouts. Perhaps he wanted to imitate the methods of those farmers, but it was very clear that the 2 furry deer did not understand his commands. Fortunately, that the general direction was correct. In short, they were walking south. The south was still very far, but as long as they persevered, they would get closer and closer. Suli lay in the carriage. Under his body was a thick blanket, and his body was covered with a smooth and flexible animal skin. The yellow paper umbrella was placed next to him, along with wine and food. He held the bamboo flute in his hand, bringing it to his lips. From time to time, it would let out a clear and beautiful sound. He seemed extremely content, without any hint of the miserable feeling of fleeing with heavy injuries. After walking for another 2 days, they could faintly see an earthy yellow city ahead of them. It was different from the military stronghold they had seen before. This was a real city. Judging from the size of the city, it could accommodate at least tens of thousands of people. It must be very prosperous and lively. If they wanted to re-establish contact with the human world, there was no doubt that this was the most convenient place to do so. Qin Changsheng turned his head to glance at Suli, using his eyes to ask if he wanted to enter the city. Suli held a piece of fur and was currently carefully wiping the holes on the bamboo flute. He did not even pay any attention to him. Qin Changsheng understood, but there were still some things he didn't understand. He shook his head and pulled the rope in his hand, letting the 2 furry deer pull the carriage down the official road through the slightly hardened fields, and around the earthy yellow city. There was a birch forest in the south of the city. The thousands of birch trees were not thick, but rather thin and straight. They were like swords that grew from the ground and pierced towards the sky. It was late spring, but the birch forest in the frigid zone hadn't grown too many green leaves yet. Their line of sight wasn't hindered in the slightest, and they were able to see the other side of the forest several li away. When encountering a forest, one should not enter. This was not an experience that Su Li had taught Qin Changsheng to travel the world, but an old saying that he had seen countless times in those random records. Qin Changsheng gently pulled the rope tight, indicating that the two furry deer should stop. He did not sense any danger, and only did this subconsciously. Su Li sat up in the carriage with difficulty. At some point, the bamboo flute in his hand had been stuck at his waist, replaced by the yellow paper umbrella. He looked at the quiet birch forest and suddenly said, "They're here." What was here? Naturally, the enemy had come. The person that wanted to kill Su Li had come. Qin Changsheng's mood instantly became nervous. He jumped from the carriage to the ground and used his fastest speed to untie the rope around the neck of the furry deer. He used the sheath of his sword to heavily hit their thick buttocks twice. The furry deer felt the pain and ran in the opposite direction of the birch forest. It was just that these animals had docile natures, so they actually did not run very far. They stood several dozen zhang away and looked at Qin Changsheng. They seemed very confused, as if they did not understand why Qin Changsheng had hit them. "You're worried about their lives, but what about me?" Su Li was very angry as he looked at Qin Changsheng. Qin Changsheng gripped the sheath of his sword and said, "Then, Senior, do you want to go in or not?" When he had just left the hot spring in the snowy ridge, he had asked Su Li, but Su Li was not willing. Moreover, it seemed that even now, Su Li had not changed his mind. He only heard Su Li sneer and say, "If I want to go in, what if you die? I'm not willing to place all my hopes on someone else, let alone someone as weak as you." Qin Changsheng thought to himself, this really is reasonable. Although Senior is currently unable to fight, his battle experience and wisdom far surpass mine by several hundred times. With him at my side, he can at least tell me a little. There was no movement in the quiet birch forest. He asked somewhat uneasily, "What do I do next? Should I charge into the forest?" Su Li completely did not understand what he meant. He asked, "Why do you want to charge into the forest?" Qin Changsheng said, "Yesterday, Senior said that the most important thing in battle is that instant when you switch from defense to offense. If you can truly catch your opponent off guard, then even the strongest opponent can lose." Su Li stared at him and said, "So you're prepared to charge into the forest, find that person, and then kill him?" Qin Changsheng very obediently nodded his head. Su Li held his forehead and said, "Do you know what level of cultivation that assassin in the forest is at?" Qin Changsheng very obediently shook his head. Su Li angrily said, "Then you're prepared to charge and just like that? Do you want to throw away your life?" Qin Changsheng was very confused. He did not know whether to nod or to shake his head. After thinking it over, he said, "Isn't this acting according to Senior's instructions?" Su Li was furious and helplessly said, "You have to understand. Those things I said before. First of all, you have to establish the foundation that your level is about the same as your opponent. Even if it's a bit lacking, it can't be too far apart." Qin Changsheng said, but Senior's original words were clearly, "Even the strongest opponent can lose." Su Li angrily said, "Rhetoric, this is rhetoric. Do you even understand rhetoric? Exaggeration is an art of language." Qin Changsheng silently lowered his head. After a while, he could not help but raise his head and ask, "Then if I really do encounter an opponent far stronger than me, what do I do?" The answer Su Li gave was abnormally concise and clear, straightforward and clear. "Flee or kneel. Flee." Qin Changsheng's speed, with Su Li on his back, was not necessarily faster than the assassin that had yet to appear in the forest. It must be known that assassins always possessed movement techniques and speed that were faster than ordinary cultivators. Kneel? Qin Changsheng and Su Li were the same. They would not completely entrust their lives to someone else, even if it was someone they trusted, let alone someone who wanted to kill them. He could not flee, nor could he kneel. In truth, there was still one other way to deal with it. Wait. Qin Changsheng unsheathed his dagger and gazed at the silent birch forest. He gazed at those green sprouts that seemed to gradually become gloomy from afar, but were very difficult to see up close. He waited for that person to appear. That person still did not appear. Time slowly passed. The hand that he used to hold the dagger had become somewhat sore. He yelled towards the forest, "Come out, he's seen you." Suli had completely not imagined that he would do such a thing. He shook his head towards the sky, somewhat ashamed to be associated with him. There was still no response from the forest. Qin Changsheng lowered his voice and said, "Senior, it seems that the method of luring the enemy is also not very effective." His previous conversation with Su Li could even be described as a dispute, so it was naturally not a true dispute. Gazing at the quiet birch forest, Su Li thoughtfully said, "That person has left." "HM?" Qin Changsheng was somewhat surprised. Su Li once again lay back down in the carriage, put down the yellow paper umbrella, and took up the bamboo flute. Under Qin Changsheng's summons, the two furry deer slowly strolled back and docilely allowed the rope to be tied back to their necks. The bamboo flute rang out, and they set off once more. In the following journey, Qin Changsheng became much quieter, or perhaps it could be said that he was more like his usual self. Only when facing Tang 36 and Su Li would he speak more. His current silence was obviously because of that assassin that he did not know would appear at any time. Just like how not speaking was sometimes more powerful than speaking, an enemy that did not appear would always be more frightening than an enemy that stood in front of you. However, Su Li was the same as usual. There was not the slightest uneasiness on his body. He continued to play the bamboo flute, continued to drink the wine, and continued to recover from his injuries. It was just like that day when he was lying in the hot spring in the snowy mountains, very contented and calm. It was as if he had not suffered any heavy injuries and was just going through an ordinary journey. Qin Changsheng vigilantly watched all the scenery in his line of sight. The pressure on his heart was very great, and a few things he thought of made his mood even heavier and heavier. Encountering two assassins in the military stronghold and the great Zhou cavalry searching everywhere for them meant that it was as Su Yan had guessed. Black Robe had calculated the direction they had fled in and had sent this information to some powers in the human world. What would those powers do next? If it was the Divine Empress who had ordered the pursuit of Su Li, then did she know that he was with Su Li? If she knew, would she have those experts and assassins kill him along the way? If it was the powerful figures of the Li Palace who wanted Su Li dead, then did they know that he was still alive? Or would the demons deliberately conceal his existence? At dusk on a certain day, 800 li from Tianliang County, the deer carriage once again stopped to rest. The twilight was as thick as blood. Qin Changsheng completely revealed his unease to Su Li. Right now, no matter what problems there were between him and Su Li's camp, since he had not abandoned Su Li in the snowy mountains, then there was no reason for him to abandon Su Li midway. They were currently sitting in the same carriage, so they naturally had to face the oncoming gales and great waves together. There won't be too many people who know that I'm heavily injured. I already told you the reason a few days ago. Let's analyze the assassination we encountered in the military stronghold. If we take that crude and laughable act as an assassination, then associate it with those several hundred Zhou cavalry, then we can see very clearly that whether it's them who want to kill me or me who is about to be killed by them, neither of them wants the entire continent to know of this matter. Su Li took up a branch and drew a map in the mud. Pointing at a straight line, he said, "They don't need to surround us and attack reinforcements, so there's only one reason why they haven't made a move until now. Our speed is too fast, so much so that after we broke through the northern front line, those people still didn't have enough time to send people strong enough to kill us. If we view this as a war, then their main force is currently on the way." Qin Changsheng squatted on the side, attentively listening. In the past few days, this sort of scene had occurred many times. Normally, Su Li would appear extremely frivolous, but at times like this, he was extremely serious. He taught Chun Changsheng how to distinguish between the traces of beasts and people, how to distinguish which plants could be eaten, which fungi were poisonous, what was most important in battle, and even taught him how to arrange an army. Besides the sword and cultivation, he taught Chun Changsheng many other things. Chun Changsheng asked again, "Senior, just why are you teaching me these things? To choose a future pope for the Southerners?" This might be the true answer, but it was not enough. "Because I taught Xiushan." Su Li threw away the branch and said, "He studied with me for a month. If we had enough time on the road, I would have also taught you for a month. You returned the yellow paper umbrella to me, and I took you away from the snowy plains, so the two sides are even. However, you did not leave the snowy mountains, so I owe you a favor. Just treat it as me returning the favor." Favor? In the future, you will inevitably begin to compete with Xiushan. I hope that you will not fall too far behind, and try to be as fair as possible. This is me returning the favor to you. After the hot spring in the snowy mountains, Chun Changsheng was once again moved by Su Li's demeanor as an expert. Then he seriously said, "I did not return the yellow paper umbrella to Senior. I was only lending it to Senior." Su Li calmly looked at him, then suddenly laughed. "You're not used to this warm scene, so you intentionally broke it?" Chun Changsheng replied, "Yes." Su Li said, "I'm also not used to it, so don't ask me similar questions in the future." Chun Changsheng looked at him and said seriously, "Senior, you really are a good person." Su Li looked at him and said seriously, "Also don't say such things in the future." "Why?" "Because in the future, you will know that I have never been a good person in the traditional sense. I am temperamental, and with a single word of disagreement, I will explode and kill. But I really can't tell, fine? Senior, although I said those words on purpose, in reality, the yellow paper umbrella really is mine. It seems like you really don't believe that I will explode and kill. Senior, if you could still explode and kill right now, why would we only dare to move in the middle of the night? Since they could not see eye to eye, there is no need to say anything more." In the growing dusk, Chun Changsheng began to prepare dinner and tools for sleeping in the open. Su Li looked at the youth busying by the fire and slightly narrowed his eyes. He slowly stroked the bamboo flute in his hand, thinking about something. The dusk gradually retreated. After a simple meal of roasted meat, Chun Changsheng extinguished the fire, ensuring that it would not become a lantern in the night. After a night without words, morning arrived. The morning breeze was slightly cool, carrying with it the scent of dew and grass, making people feel relaxed and happy. The two furry deer happily strode forward, and in a short while, they had already traveled over 10 li. On the vast plains grew green plants, probably sorghum. However, these sorghum plants had only just begun to grow, so they did not have the green gauze canopy of the legends, and were even less capable of concealing one's figure. As a result, Chun Changsheng saw the person in the field with a glance. It was a handsome man, covered from head to toe in armor. On his back were 7 long blades, incomparably bright in the morning light. No matter how he looked, he did not seem like an assassin. The next chapter was to strive for before 10 o'clock. Chapter 366. That man was very handsome. Although his face was covered in dust, it was clear that he had traveled a lot. The armor on his body was also covered in a thick layer of dust, but it was still bright, just like his person. Standing in the green sorghum field, he was like a sun. This kind of person did not seem like an assassin at all. In reality, this man truly was not an assassin, even though he had come to kill Su Li. This man did not release any kindness, nor did he have any hostility, but he also did not conceal his killing intent, an extremely pure killing intent. Seeing this bright man in the morning light, Chun Changsheng felt a stabbing pain in his eyes, just like how he felt when he first saw Su Li on the snowy plains. The light from the distance fell on the man's body, but it did not truly fall. What reflected the light was not his armor or his face, but an invisible barrier, which was why it was so bright. That invisible barrier, this light, both indicated that the other was a true expert of the star condensation realm. With just a glance, Chun Changsheng confirmed that this man was not the assassin from a few days ago in the birch forest. This person was too bright, unable to conceal his existence. Moreover, he could see that this person did not seem to have any intention of doing so. He just stood in the morning light, openly waiting for Qin Changsheng and Su Li to arrive. Qin Changsheng got off the carriage, untied the rope around the neck of the deer, and lightly patted their fleshy buttocks. Now, these two furry deer could already communicate with his mind and understand his intentions. They trotted to the sorghum several hundred zhang away, then turned their heads to look at the field, waiting for their young master to summon them back again in a moment. Qin Changsheng turned his head to look at the carriage. Su Li was lying in the carriage, his eyes closed. He was wrapped in fur, and his ears were stuffed with fur. He seemed to be sleeping again. "Senior," Qin Changsheng said. The fur in Su Li's ear clearly did not have the effect of isolating the fur in Mou's ear. He said, When he said yes, his eyes were still closed. "In front, there's a person coming." Qin Changsheng pointed at the man in the sorghum field behind him. And then, Su Li still had no intention of opening his eyes. Qin Changsheng said, "That person is very strong. I can't beat him." Su Li closed his eyes and said, "I've taught you for so many days. If you still can't take care of an assassin, then why don't you just die?" Qin Changsheng said, "But senior, you just said yesterday that that was just rhetoric and exaggeration. When encountering an opponent far too inferior, other than kneeling, we can only run. I want to ask, should we run or kneel right now?" After a moment of silence, Su Li finally opened his eyes. He stood up and looked at the green sorghum field in front. He said, "Star Realm, it's not like you can't fight." Qin Changsheng quickly weighed the pros and cons in his mind again. He shook his head and said, I really can't beat him." Only now did Su Li clearly see the handsome man covered in armor and incomparably bright. He squinted his eyes and said, "It's this guy. Then you really can't beat him." Qin said, "Then let's quickly." Su Li said unhappily, "Let's not talk about the fact that I, Su Li, have never escaped in my life. Even if I really wanted to escape, can I escape?" Qin Changsheng was just about to say that if he really started running, there really weren't many people on the continent that could catch up to him. Suddenly, he saw a fiery red warhorse in the distant green field. He looked somewhat familiar. He suddenly had a very bad feeling, because he finally recognized that the fiery red warhorse in the distance was actually a red cloud Qilin. Su Li said, "Xue Xingchuan's younger brother, the 28th Divine General, Xue He. Yes, his mount and Xue Xingchuan's mount are also brothers." Qin Changsheng gave up on the idea of escaping. There was no white crane here, and he was not Jin Yulu, so there was no way he could be faster than the red cloud Qilin that could fly. He did not expect that the first assassin he met on his way back to the south would be such a powerful figure. But on second thought, it made sense. In order to kill Su Li, even if he was already heavily injured, it would be meaningless no matter how many ordinary experts came. The one who came should naturally be someone on the level of Divine General Xue He. "Greetings, Mr. Su. Forgive me for being in full armor and not being able to greet you." Standing on the green plains that did not even reach his knees, Xue He was radiant and mighty, like a statue of a god. However, his tone of voice towards Su Li was extremely polite. Su Li expressionlessly looked at him and said, "Based on my understanding of you, you should admire me very much." For some reason, any words that were narcissistic to the point of nausea coming from the mouth of this junior martial uncle of Mount Li would make people feel that they were sincere and trustworthy. Xue He slowly walked over, constantly changing in the reflection of the morning light. His armor clattered against each other, and he used his silence to express his approval. Su Li asked, "Whose intention is it that you appear here?" Xue He's older brother, Xue Xingchuan, was the continent's second-ranked Divine General. After Divine General Han Qing guarded the Mausoleum of Books, he became the world's strongest Divine General, only below the 5 Saints and the Storms of the 8 Directions. Most importantly, everyone knew that Xue Xingchuan was the Divine Empress's most loyal follower. Logically speaking, Xue He's appearance here naturally revealed a cruel and terrifying truth. The person who wanted to kill Su Li was the Divine Empress. But Suli would not believe it so simply, so he asked. Shui expressionlessly said, "It's not anyone's intention. It's my own intention." Suli was silent. He understood what he meant, but Chen Changsheng did not understand. Since this was not a decree from the Divine Empress, nor was it an order from the Orthodoxy, why did this divine general, who admired Su Li, want to kill him? Moreover, he wanted to take advantage of his perilous state. He asked why. Shui did not pay attention to him. He looked at Su Li and calmly said, "Only with the confluence of the North and South can our great Zhou unify the world, can we truly defeat the demons. But because of teacher's existence, it has always been difficult to advance. Whether it's the imperial court or the orthodoxy, there are many people who hope that teacher can change his attitude, but I know that teacher will not change his attitude. So, teacher must die." Suli sternly said, "I will change." This was a joke, not funny, and no one believed it. But Suli appeared to believe it very much. He sincerely said, "As long as you are willing to let us go, I will definitely change my attitude towards the confluence of the North and South." After a moment of silence, Shui said, "I view teacher as my idol. I know that teacher will not change." Suli said in slight embarrassment, "How can you be so stubborn? If I say I will change, then I will definitely change. To change one's mind because of external forces, then that is not teacher." Shui looked at him and calmly said, "If teacher is no longer teacher, why would I still have any psychological barriers when I kill you?" Suli was silent for a moment, then looked at Chen Changsheng and said, "Did I not say it properly?" Chen Changsheng nodded. Suli said, "Then it's your turn to say something." Chen Changsheng said, "Senior, I'm really not good at talking." Seeing Su Li and Chen Changsheng converse, a strange light flashed through Shui's eyes. Soon after, he calmed himself and said solemnly, "For now, there are still very few people who know that teacher is heavily injured and is currently returning to the south. Dying under my blade is always better than dying under the hands of those thieves and rascals, or being killed by the dirty tricks of those assassins." Suli shook his head and said, "No matter how you die, it's fine as long as you live." Shui said no more. His right hand reached behind him and grasped the hilt of a blade. After Zhou Dufu, very few experts of the continent used blades because there were pearls and jade in front of them. Many of the 38 divine generals of the continent were used to using swords, and because of Emperor Taizong's frost god spear, there were also quite a few who used spears. There was only one divine general who used a blade, and who used it so well, Shui. With this action, the other 6 slender blades behind Shui did not leave their sheaths, but 6-blade intense soared into the air, enveloping the green plains. This was the blade domain. Su Li's expression gradually restrained. He also did not think that the first person who came to kill him would be such a troublesome person. Chen Changsheng's voice was slightly hoarse as he asked, "Senior, what do we do?" Su Li said expressionlessly, "You can also see that this guy is the same as the meat you roast. It's not even cold, so what else can we do?" Chen Changsheng turned his head and glanced at him. He asked in confusion, "Me? Impenetrable?" Su Li said unhappily and got off the carriage with difficulty. Looking at the green plains, he suddenly squinted his eyes again. Gao Yang was still very short, but there was actually another person hiding in the plains. It was probably that person in the birch forest. See you tomorrow. Chapter 367. The northern part of Tianliang County was still rather cold. Gao Yang was not very high, but it could hide a person. Presumably, that person was extremely skilled in concealing his tracks and was a true assassin. Suli did not pay any attention to the assassin hiding in the plains. No matter how dangerous that person was, in his eyes, it was not as important as the bright Shui. Shui continued to walk towards the two. His armor clanked, and his blade intent whistled through the air. His footsteps were steady and firm. As he got closer and closer, he looked at Chen Changsheng and asked warily, "And who are you?" Chen Changsheng did not intentionally restrain his qi, so Shui could see that he had already entered the upper level of ethereal opening. To be able to enter the upper level of ethereal opening at such a young age, he was definitely not a normal person. Shui had never even met such a person before. He expressionlessly said, "If I didn't know that Xiushan Jun was heavily injured in the Garden of Zhou and was far away in Mount Li, if you didn't have such an ordinary appearance, I really would have suspected that you were Xiushan Jun." Chun Changsheng finally confirmed that the demons, or perhaps that mysterious black robe, for some reason, had not sent the news that he was following Su Li to the south. He could not help but begin to think, if Shui knew his identity, would he stop? Just then, Su Li's voice rang out. "If your elder brother, Shui Xingchuan, were here, he would definitely not mistake him for Qiushan Jun. This kid is only at the upper level of ethereal opening, while my Qiushan has already succeeded in star condensation. Can't he even see this difference?" Only a person like Su Li would use the word talented when commenting on this matter, and in the current younger generation of cultivators, probably only Qiushan Jun could firmly suppress Qin Changsheng. This was the truth, but for some reason, Chun Changsheng felt somewhat depressed. Perhaps it was because Su Li had mentioned Qiushan Jun in a very intimate tone that made him momentarily forget to tell Shui his identity. And at this moment, Shui had already arrived less than 10 zhang away from the two. His hand had already completely fused with the hilt of the blade, and the 6 blade intents had already fused into one, forming a world of their own. Shui had already made his preparations to attack. His qi had already been raised to its peak. The star domain that only star condensation experts could summon was extremely perfect. He used the blade, so his star domain was the blade domain. No matter how much of a genius Chen Changsheng was, he was still too young and had a limited amount of time to cultivate. Furthermore, there were problems with his meridians in the first place, so the amount of quintessence he could bring out was limited. There was no way he could break this perfect saber domain. Most of the time, the gap between realms couldn't be bridged with courage, willpower, determination, or techniques. He stared at Shui's visor, which was extremely bright under the morning light, and slowly pulled out the short sword from its sheath. In a very short period of time, he had performed many calculations in his sea of consciousness. The countless examples of battles that he had seen in the Taoist canon and the books of the Orthodox Academy floated before his eyes, but he still could not do anything. Without question, the 28th Divine General of the continent, Shui, was the strongest opponent he had ever encountered since he began cultivating. Purely in terms of cultivation, he was equal to the demon general couple in the Garden of Zhou. However, in order to enter the Garden of Zhou, the demon general couple had forcefully used a secret technique to suppress their cultivation. Because of the restrictions of the Garden of Zhou, when they fought, they had almost never revealed the true strength of the star condensation realm. The golden-winged great Peng that Nank had ignited her soul to awaken had been chopped down from the vault of heaven by his 10,000 swords. However, the majority of the power of that strike had come from the desire of the 10,000 broken swords in the sword pool that had accumulated for several hundred years. That kind of willpower and imposing manner had nothing to do with him, and the opportunity had not come. Right now, the 10,000 broken swords in his sheath could no longer display such a great power. How could he defeat this powerful opponent? Chun Changsheng gripped the short sword and stared at the approaching Shui, his heart growing more and more nervous. Shui knew that he was his opponent, yet he did not pay much attention to him. His gaze fell behind him, always looking at Su Li. Let alone being heavily injured, even if he was on the verge of death and only had one last breath left, as long as Su Li was still alive, he would be the most terrifying expert of the continent. Su Li was also looking at him. But in reality, Su Li was not looking at him, but at his blade domain. Suddenly, Su Li's gaze fell on a certain place in the air in front of him. At the same time, he extended his hand and gripped the handle of the yellow paper umbrella. Within the yellow paper umbrella was the heaven-shrouding sword, and the handle of the umbrella was the hilt of the sword. Back then on the snowy plains, Su Li had gripped the hilt of the sword, and his sword intent had invaded like fire, directly killing a demon general several dozen li away. Now that Shui was right in front of him, he could even more sense that intense danger. Without any warning, purely out of an instinctive vigilance, Shuehi exploded with an incomparably powerful chi. The morning light was like before, and the armor on his body instantly became incomparably bright. With a clang, the metal blade was unsheathed, and through Chun Changxing's shoulder, it chopped down at Su Li's hand that gripped the handle of the umbrella. A violent hurricane arose from the verdant sorghum. On the entire journey south, Chun Changxing was most clear on Su Li's current condition. Let alone using his sword to kill, he could not even walk. He did not understand why Su Li would grip the handle of the umbrella, why he would use his sword intent to force Shuehi to suddenly strike. This was a question that Su Li had given him. Chun Changxing thought for a very short amount of time before obtaining the answer. This was because Su Li had taught him a lot, and he had studied very seriously, not forgetting a single word or phrase. A few days ago, Su Li had once said to him that the most important thing in battle was the instant when one switched from defense to offense. If one could truly catch the opponent off guard, then even the strongest opponent could still lose. Shuehi's striking seemed to be because of Su Li's actions, because of his vigilance and unease, and because he was forced to do so. But in reality, he was also going with the flow, because only like this could he truly catch the opponent off guard. In order to kill an expert on Su Li's level, before Shuehi struck, he had assuredly calculated all the details. As expected, the most important moment in battle was the moment when one switched from defense to offense. But was it only because doing this well would bring benefits? No. Chun Changxing remembered very clearly that after Su Li said these words, he had given another explanation. Even the strongest opponent, in the instant when one switched from defense to offense, would have to expend even more effort. So it was also at this moment that it was the easiest to reveal a flaw. In other words, an enemy so powerful that it was almost perfect would only become imperfect in the instant when one switched from defense to offense. Chun Changxing's eyes lit up. Because of the descending snow-like glow of Shuehi's blade, and also because of the gradually flourishing morning light. His dagger had already pierced out. 3 forms of Wenshui, hanging sunset. The dagger buzzed, carrying with it all the morning light on the sorghum. Vibrating at high speeds, it pierced towards Shuehi's chest. As a star condensation expert, Shuehi's domain formed from his 7 blades was impregnable. Even in the instant when he switched from defense to offense, he might leave behind a weak point in his defense. But how could he let Chun Changxing see it? Chun Changxing truly could not see it, but there were people who could. Su Li only needed a glance to see where the weak point of Shuehi's blade domain was. He extended his hand and gripped the handle of a yellow paper umbrella, provoking Shuehi to strike. His gaze had always been fixed on a certain place in the air in front of Shuehi. Chun Changxing's dagger followed Su Li's gaze and pierced over. With a soft squelch, it was like a skin bag filled with wine had been pierced, or like a sugar figurine that had been blown up had been secretly pierced by a naughty child with a bamboo skewer. In the bright morning light that enveloped Shuehi, a path suddenly appeared. The sharp sword glow had already arrived in front of his chest. On the bright armor, one could even see the shadow of the sword. Due to some emotional problems, writing was rather strenuous. The next chapter will be updated very late. There is no need for everyone to wait. Chapter 368. Chun Changxing's sword arrived in front of Shuehi. The truly sharp sword was Su Li's gaze. But if a star condensation expert could be so easily defeated, why would the Taoist canon call the star domain an individual world? The bright morning light suddenly changed for an instant. Shuehi's hand reached behind his back and pulled out a second blade. Because his movements were truly too fast, a blur appeared, as if a second him had appeared in the morning light. The sharp, snow-white blade descended even faster than sound, chopping towards Chun Changxing's head. Chun Changxing's sword energy was about to run out, so he had no way of changing the trajectory of the dagger, much less blocking this blade. What could he do? A buzzing sound came from the green sorghum again. A heavy iron sword appeared out of nowhere and blocked Shuehi's blade. Even with Shuehi's level of cultivation, he could not break this metal sword. This metal sword was the mountain sea sword. Shui's face was expressionless. Another blur appeared, and with unimaginable speed, he pulled out a second blade from his back and chopped down. His movements were truly too fast. When the second blade descended, the mountain sea sword had just met the first blade. With Chen Changxing's strength, it was simply impossible for him to keep up with such a fast speed, because it was impossible for ethereal opening cultivators to draw their swords so quickly. However, the way he drew his sword was different from other people in the world. He did not need to shake his wrist to draw his sword, did not need to make any movements, not even need to move his fingers. He only needed to use his spiritual sense, and a sword would fly out of its sheath, blocking the blade in Shui's hand. The second sword was the South Stream Temple's Holy Maiden Sword. Shui's pupils constricted, clearly shaken by Chen Changxing's two famed swords that had appeared out of nowhere. However, the movements of his hand did not slow in the slightest. Another blur appeared in the morning light, and he struck out a third time. Almost at the same time as the third blade fell, Chen Changxing summoned a third sword. Only a truly powerful sword, a sword that was in relatively good condition, could block divine General Shui's powerful blade, so the third sword was the Demon Commander's banner sword. Everything happened too quickly in the blink of an eye. The morning light flickered faintly, and the afterimages appeared again. Shui seemed to have turned into 6 people, pulling out 6 blades and slashing towards Chen Changsheng's head. Chen Changsheng seemed to be motionless in front of him, yet 6 swords appeared out of nowhere and blocked in front of him. Only now did the continuous sounds of collisions resound. It was like a series of spring thunder that bloomed in the green plains. Shui's blade was too fast. If Chen Changsheng was only relying on his own ability, he definitely wouldn't be able to block it, but Shui probably didn't expect this youngster to have such a strange technique. What were those swords? This was not the end. Shui's 6 afterimages vanished at the same time, returning to his original body. The blade that he had slashed at Su Li actually swept downwards, once again slashing at Chen Changxing's neck. This was his first blade, and also his last blade. It was the real blade. When this saber landed, the 7 sabers became a perfect world again. His saber domain was perfected once more, and all the holes from before disappeared without a trace. As the blade descended, Shui's gaze was very cold, as if he was asking Chen Changsheng, "Do you still have more swords?" The terrifying blade energy brought about by the 7 blades crushed Chen Changsheng to the point where breathing became extremely difficult, and even his thoughts seemed to slow down. Otherwise, perhaps he would have thought of sentence. I still have more than 10,000 swords, and I also need to tell you, but at this moment, even if he sent out 10,000 swords, it would still be meaningless because Shui's saber domain had descended once more. His dagger could not break through, could not stab into his opponent's body. The gap between cultivation levels was just this hard to make up for. Fortunately, Su Li was still behind him. He looked at Shui, his calm gaze like a sword that had been washed in autumn water. "Heavenly Palace," he said, his gaze falling on Shui's ribs. Chen Changxing's dagger followed. Shui's expression turned slightly cold. He had used a profound method to reconstruct his saber domain, but who could have thought that Su Li would still only need a glance to see through his only weakness? But he was not worried, because Su Li was already heavily injured. He could only speak, but could not use his sword. As a star condensation expert, coupled with his armor, it was not something that a youth at ethereal opening could break through. So he did not hesitate, and decided to quickly end this battle, no longer paying attention to Chen Changxing's dagger. If this battle was analyzed in hindsight, apart from Su Li's insight and Chen Changxing's strength and composure that far exceeded his age, the most important reason was that Shui had made a fatal mistake at the most crucial moment. He did not think that the seemingly ordinary dagger in Chen Changxing's hand was actually one of the sharpest swords in the world, especially after being baptized by the wind and rain in the Garden of Zhou. This dagger possessed the sword intent of the Dragoncry sword, possessed its own sword spirit, and inherited the unparalleled heroic will of Chen Xuanba from countless years ago. It was actually able to display a power that surpassed its cultivation level. With a squelch, The dagger in Chun Changxing's hand pierced through the bright armor on Shui He's body, breaking through his body that was as hard as metal and stone after purification. Like a violent gale, it continued to advance, as if it wanted to destroy everything in its path. An angry howl mixed with shock and pain rang out. Shui had never thought that his moment of carelessness would allow this ethereal opening youth to succeed and place himself in such a dangerous situation. The true essence in his body exploded out. Qin Changxing's dagger could not continue forward. Shui used his entire cultivation, condensing the star domain in front of his chest, and forcefully used his true essence to block this dagger. The blade in his hand continued to chop towards Chun Changxing's neck, let alone the fact that Chun Changxing's dagger could not continue forward. Even if it could, it would at most heavily injure Shui, but this blade would definitely cut off his head. It was like this. Qin Changxing knew that he had lost. He did not think that a star condensation expert, at the juncture of life and death, could actually explode with such a terrifying battle strength, actually able to transform true essence into something that seemed to have substance. For him to be able to cultivate to the upper level of ethereal opening at this age, he could already be considered a peerless genius. But in front of a star condensation expert, he still seemed to be unable to withstand a single blow. Even with Su Li's guidance, even with his performance exceeding his own level, his defeat to Shui, he was actually a very natural matter. But why was he still somewhat unwilling? Was he unwilling to die, or was he unwilling to die immediately without being able to truly injure Shui? Qin Changxing did not think this way. He knew that he could injure Shui, so he continued to attack, not caring that he might die in the next moment. In a battle between cultivators, it was extremely rare to see a sudden change in sword energy at the last moment, because this went against the common sense of cultivation and the principles of nature. Unless before the sword was attacked, this change had already been hidden in the sword technique. This kind of sword technique was extremely rare. In the last few years, the most famous of the sword techniques was called the Burning Heaven Sword. The Burning Heaven Sword was a sword technique of Mount Li, a secret technique created by Su Li himself. In terms of ingenuity, it was even above the secret sword of the Golden Crow. What Qin Changxing used was the Burning Heaven Sword. He knew this kind of sword technique and had used it before in the Grand Examination, but at that time, he had used his fist as a sword. This was the first time he had truly used this sword technique. Qin Changxing's sword used an incomprehensible method to flick upwards, drawing a seemingly natural line on Shui's bright armor. The hard armor incessantly shattered and sprayed. It was like a field ignited by lightning, spitting flames towards the sky. Fuck! An extremely clear sound rang out. With a spurt of blood, Shui's left arm was cut off and sent flying into the sky. Almost at the same time, Shui's blade landed on Qin Changxing's neck. With a thunderous explosion, the flames on the field were completely extinguished. Qin Changxing's knee landed heavily on the ground in front of the carriage. The earth shook and dust flew into the air. Only now did the Mountain Sea Sword and the other 5 broken swords descend from the sky. With a sound, they landed by his side. Chapter 369. There was silence. Shui's left arm had been severed. From his abdomen to his shoulder was a pool of blood. His face was pale. His right hand gripped the blade and rested it on Qin Changxing's neck. Qin Changxing's head had not been chopped off. Shui's blade energy had been exhausted and could not continue forward. At some point, an old umbrella had appeared between the blade and Qin Changxing's neck. A rather tired voice rang out, "You've lost." The old umbrella was held in Su Li's hand. These words came from his mouth. Shui withdrew the blade in his hand and slowly and heavily retreated 2 steps. He looked at Su Li with a pale face and asked somewhat perplexedly, "This is that yellow paper umbrella?" Then he looked at Qin Changxing in front of the carriage. He looked at the youth covered in dust and confirmed that his head was still on his neck. The perplexed expression on his face grew even stronger, and he muttered, "How can it be so sturdy?" Previously, when he had risked his blade domain to chop down, he had condensed the cultivation of his entire life, the full power strike of a star condensation expert. Even if Su Li had exceeded everyone's expectations and still had the strength to fight, even if that yellow paper umbrella could block all sharpness in the world, it could not stop the transmission of power. Logically speaking, Chen Changxing's neck should have been severed no matter what, but now it seemed that he had not received any damage. Shui was very confused. Just what material was this youth's body made of? It was actually countless times more exaggerated than a perfect purification. Suddenly, the carriage collapsed, turning into countless fragments. The ground under the carriage also neatly sank down half a foot. Su Li fell to the ground, coughing from the dust and incessantly waving his hands. Chen Changxing stood up with difficulty and held his sword horizontally in front of him, preparing to deal with Shui's following attack. He was currently in great pain. His sea of consciousness trembled as if it could shatter at any moment. The world in front of him was a blur, and he could faint at any moment. Fortunately, Su Li's gaze was very accurate, so he could see through his blade technique and easily point out the only flaw in his blade domain. If he said Shui had lost, then Shui had really lost. Chen Changsheng's short sword had cut a deep wound on his armor. Although it wasn't able to break through his true essence defense and pierce through his heart, the sword force of the one-sword strike of burning heaven had already shattered all the meridians in the left half of his body. For a short period of time, Shui no longer had the ability to fight. If he could leave alive, who knew how long it would take for him to recover to his original state? Shui held onto the place where his arm was continuously bleeding and looked at Chen Changsheng. His emotions were very complicated. He could never have imagined that he would actually lose to this youngster's sword. Suddenly, he thought of a possibility. His expression changed slightly, and he asked, "You are Chen Changsheng?" Chen Changsheng had just walked on the edge of life and death, and his mind was still in a daze. The power of Shui's blade was still flooding his sea of consciousness, and he couldn't clearly hear what Shui was saying. Shui thought that Chen Changsheng had tacitly agreed and could not help but be stunned. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he did not say anything. He turned to Su Li and said, "I didn't think that Sir Su could still use your sword. I really brought disgrace on this trip." Su Li raised his eyebrows slightly and said with some dissatisfaction, "This is just an umbrella, not a sword. If I use my sword and you can still stand, then it should be my turn to feel disgrace." Shui was silent for a while and realized that there was no doubt in his words. After a while, he sincerely asked for guidance. "Sir, could it be that my blade really can't compare to Wang Pe? Of the 38 divine generals of the continent, very few people use the blade, and none of them use the blade as well as Shui. However, on this continent, there was still one expert who used the blade, and he was also considered to be the person with the strongest blade after Zhou Dufu. That person was Wang Pe of Tianyang. When everyone mentioned Shui, they would praise his blade technique as godly, but they would inevitably add that he was just not as good as Wang Pe. Shui had come today to kill Su Li, but at the moment when his life was about to end, the matter that he could not let go of the most was not Su Li's life or death, nor was it his own life or death, but this matter. He wanted to hear what Su Li had to say, so that he could leave with peace of mind, or perhaps convince himself. Of course, you are not as good as Wang Pe, whether it's the blade or the person. Su Li did not give this divine general who was on the verge of death any comfort or gentleness, and said very directly. Shui was not angry. He seriously asked for guidance. "What's the reason?" Su Li said, "Wang Pe only uses one blade, and you use 7, so you are not as good as him." Shui seemed to understand something. He knew that if he could understand these words, he would definitely make great progress on the path of the blade. Just as he was feeling happy, he suddenly remembered that he was about to die and could not help but laugh at himself. Chen Changsheng had been somewhat distracted by that blade strike, and now he finally began to slowly wake up. Su Li did not say anything, and Shui also did not say anything. The scene was quiet. He looked at Shui and then looked at Su Li. Somewhat perplexed, he asked, "Next, what do we do?" Su Li looked at him like he was looking at an idiot and said, "What do we do? Of course, it's to quickly kill him, and then continue on our way. Shui looked at Qin Changsheng and also felt very baffled. He thought to himself, "What are you waiting for, young man?" "Ah, senior, you want me to kill him?" Qin Changsheng was the one who felt the most baffled. Suli glared at him and said, "Don't tell me you want me to do it myself." Shui said somewhat angrily, "Don't tell me you want me to do it myself." Qin Changsheng stared blankly and said, "Can no one do it? Must I kill him?" The scene once again returned to silence, and a fresh and clean wind blew through the green plains. After a long period of silence, Suli sighed with emotion. "I'm finding it more and more difficult to understand young people nowadays." Shui nodded his head in agreement. Qin Changsheng looked at Shui and said, "Sir Divine General, can you treat today's matter as if it never happened? And what I mean is, can you not hold a grudge?" Shui suddenly felt that this youth was very pleasing to the eye. No wonder his elder brother had said in the letter that this youth was very pleasing to the eye. The more he looked, the more pleasing he became. He said, "You spare my life. I will remember your kindness." Qin Changsheng looked at Su Li, using his eyes to express an inquiry. Su Li was very annoyed. He said, "Since you're not going to do it, what are you standing there for? Let's go." Qin Changsheng sheathed the 6 broken swords that were scattered on the ground, then stuck his hand into his mouth and blew 2 whistles. His technique was not good, so the whistle he blew out was rather dull and hoarse. It was not pleasant to hear, and it could not travel far. Fortunately, the 2 furry deer did not run far. Hearing the sound, they came over. Qin Changsheng helped Su Li onto the back of one of the furry deer and then rode onto the back of the other furry deer. Holding onto 2 ropes, they walked into the distance of the sorghum. Seeing the 2 people and 2 deer gradually disappear into the green plains, Shui was silent. It was unknown what he was thinking. Su Li sat on the furry deer and said to Qin Changsheng, "I really admire you." Qin Changsheng laughed somewhat embarrassedly and said, "Senior, you're too polite." Su Li suppressed his anger and said, "I'm polite to your 18 generations of ancestors. Am I talking about this?" Qin Changsheng asked in confusion, "Then what do you admire me for?" Su Li said, "Are all the young people these days as stupid as you?" Qin Changsheng said, "You mean, I didn't kill him? I think that if it was Go Hanshi, he wouldn't have done it just now." Su Li sneered, "A woman's benevolence will never amount to anything great. If the future of humanity is people like you, then what future will there be? Sooner or later, humanity will be exterminated by the demons." Qin Changsheng thought it over, then said, "Isn't it precisely because I'm this kind of person that Senior is willing to teach me and want me to become the next pope?" Su Li was silent for a while, then said, "It seems rather reasonable. But have you never thought that Shui will leak out our whereabouts, and that he will take revenge on you in the future?" Qin Changsheng said, "I've never thought about it carefully. If Senior is able to return to Mountly alive, just who would dare to take revenge on me?" Su Li said, "That assassin hiding in the sorghum might kill Shui and then say that you killed him. Have you ever thought about this?" Qin Changsheng turned to look at him and said in shock, "This? I really haven't thought about it." Su Li looked into his bright and clear eyes and suddenly did not want to continue speaking. He sighed with emotion. "How could I hope that a guy like you can become the Pope?" For some reason, Qin Changsheng felt rather apologetic. He comforted him. Senior's vision should not be wrong. The next chapter will be very, very late, possibly even later than yesterday. Chapter 370. The morning light gradually brightened, and the morning wind did not rise. The green seedlings that had just reached his knees no longer swayed. Shui loosened his right hand, and the stump of his arm was no longer bleeding. He picked up the 7 blades from the ground and slowly sheathed them. In the entire process, his pale face occasionally flashed with a pained expression. It was very clear that these simple actions were extremely difficult for him. Su Li and Qin Changsheng had already left on the furry deer, but he did not leave. Instead, he sat down and bandaged his wounds while thinking about something. After the Ivy Festival and the Grand Examination, Qin Changsheng's reputation had long since spread beyond the capital. His brother Shui Chuan had specially mentioned this youth in a letter. Shui knew that this youth was the youngest principal of the Orthodox Academy in history. It could even be said that he represented the orthodoxy and the old imperial clan in speaking to the divine empress. But this youth should be undergoing trials in the Garden of Zhou. Why did he suddenly appear in the north of Tianliang County with Su Li? Of course, the main reason he did not immediately leave was not because he was thinking, but because he was waiting for the assassin hidden in the green plains to appear. He did not know who the assassin was, although he had obtained Su Li's whereabouts from him. He only knew that since the assassin had not gone far, it meant that he was in great danger. When he left, Su Li had said to Chen Changsheng that the assassin would take advantage of Shui's heavy injuries to kill him and then push the matter onto Chen Changsheng's head. Shui himself also thought this way. Suddenly, a cool breeze blew across the quiet field. The green sorghum bent slightly in the wind, revealing a figure that looked like a stone. Suddenly, the figure disappeared again. It should have gotten closer. Shui's right hand reached behind him and grasped the hilt of his blade. As a divine general of the Great Zhou, even if he had no more strength to fight, he would still die in battle. If he really was fated to die by the hands of these sneaky people, then it was better to die by his own blade. The cool breeze continued to blow, but the assassin still did not appear. After an unknown amount of time, the sunlight gradually intensified. Just when Shui, who had lost too much blood, could not hold on any longer, he suddenly realized that the assassin had already left. Why did the assassin leave? Shui did not understand. He used his blade to support his body and stood up with difficulty. Then he saw that on the ground, not far away, someone had used the edge of a sword to write a very clear line of words. The assassin must have seen that line of words, so he did not make a move in the end. Lu Qing, Zhou Tong will know what you have done. Shui's expression changed slightly. He did not think that the assassin was actually the legendary Lu Qing, nor did he think that Su Li and Chen Changsheng would actually leave behind such words before they left. It was these words that saved his life. By a lake 500 li north of Tianliang County, 2 furry deer were currently drinking water with their heads lowered. Chen Changsheng was currently following Su Li's instructions, cleaning the grass and fruits that the furry deer were about to eat. The lake water was rather cold. He gazed at Su Li, who was resting by the lake, and asked curiously, "Who is Lu Qing?" The words on that piece of sorghum had been written by him with his dagger, but the contents had been spoken by Su Li. He had absolutely no idea what those words meant. Su Li said, "It's in the birch forest in the sorghum field, that guy who never dared to show his face." Chen Changsheng was a little surprised and said, "That assassin? Is it very powerful?" Su Li casually said, "When those old fellows in the pavilion of divination were bored, they once privately ranked the assassins of the continent. Lu Qing was ranked third on the ranking of assassins." Chen Changsheng thought about how he had been secretly followed by such a terrifying assassin the entire time and immediately felt the wind blowing over the lake become rather cold. He subconsciously looked around. Only the terrifying assassin ranked third on the ranking of assassins actually had such an ordinary name. He was somewhat confused. Su Li opened his eyes and said, "The more professional an assassin is, the less attention they attract. The outstanding assassin that has always been ranked first on the ranking of assassins doesn't even have a name." Chen Changsheng felt that these words were rather strange. Just what sort of person was this assassin that ranked first on the ranking of assassins that Su Li would actually praise as outstanding? It must be known that even the Tianhai Divine Empress and the Pope did not receive too much respect from Su Li's words. He could not understand. So he changed the subject and asked, "Sir, what was the meaning of those words you wanted me to leave behind?" Shui is Shui Xingchuan's younger brother, and Shui Xingchuan is Zhou Tong's only friend. If Zhou Tong were to find out that Lu Qing killed Shui, Lu Qing's fate would definitely be very miserable. Lu Qing is also afraid of Lord Zhou Tong. The more they cannot see the light, the more they fear Zhou Tong, including that outstanding assassin ranked first on the ranking of assassins. That person is obviously an exception, but senior You said before that after he killed Shui, he could disguise it as me. Since he's an assassin ranked third on the ranking of assassins, he definitely has a way to set it up. There's nothing suspicious about it. I know he's Lu Qing, so as long as I'm alive, Zhou Tong will know. Lord Zhou Tong will believe your words. There's no need to believe. It's enough for Zhou Tong to suspect that Lu Qing killed him. But there's no proof. When has Zhou Tong ever needed proof for his actions? Qin Changxing thought about those terrifying rumors regarding Lord Zhou Tong and thought that it really was like this. The people of the capital said that Zhou Tong's name could stop infants from crying at night, and now it seemed that it could even intimidate an assassin ranked third on the ranking of assassins. He said, I still don't understand. Why did that assassin want to kill Shui? Su Li looked at him and arched his brows. I don't understand even more. Why didn't you kill Shui? Divine General Shui, he came to kill Senior, not to kill me. Just like you said, after he knew who I was, he clearly did not have any killing intent towards me. Since that's the case, he already has no way of killing Senior. So why must I kill him? Senior, you seem to have forgotten. In terms of factions, Divine General Shui, he and I should be closer than Senior. Qin Changsheng said. On the other hand, since Senior wanted me to kill Shui, why did you want me to leave behind those words before I left? Su Li said, since you're not willing to kill him, you obviously have to let him live. You owe him enough so as to avoid suffering a loss. Qin Changsheng did not know how to respond, so he changed the subject. I don't know when that assassin will strike. He gazed at the surface of a lake in the sunset, very worried. The reputation of the junior martial uncle of Mount Li would naturally be stronger than Zhou Tong's, but the current Su Li no longer had that kind of deterrent force, especially after he had blocked Shui's blade for Qin Changsheng in the morning. The assassin is a profession that requires success the most, so it has to be the most conservative. Su Li gazed at the sunset in the lake and said, before completely confirming the state of my injuries and the limits of your abilities, he will not appear, much less act. He will only continue to wait like a retard. The chapter name is rather cool. The original version is even longer and cooler, but the chapter names of the world of creation cannot exceed 20 characters. I've already had several unpleasant experiences with this, so I've decided to respond. See you tomorrow. Chapter 371. The sunset glow on the horizon gradually disappeared, and so did the glow on the lake. The wind blowing from the lake grew colder and colder. The fire by the lake had already been extinguished, leaving behind only a few embers that did not have any warmth. Qin Changxing tightened his clothes and looked at the lake and mountains for a long time without saying anything. That assassin that had never appeared and could suddenly appear at any time. Just where was he? Su Li knew what he was feeling right now and said, I said before, since he decided to wait, he will continue to wait like a retard, until he reaches his own death. These words clearly implied something. Qin Changsheng thought, what if that assassin could not wait any longer? He did not believe that he would have any chance against such an expert. Senior still has the strength to fight. From the snowy plains to the south, Su Li could not even walk. This morning, at the most crucial moment, he had used the yellow paper umbrella to block Shui's final blade. This inevitably gave Qin Changsheng some hope. Su Li lectured, the little bit of strength I managed to save up these past few days was used to protect your little life this morning. How could I still have any strength now? Do you think I'm one of those 2 deer that can't die from exhaustion? Those 2 deer were by the lake not far away, resting with their front hooves bent. They seemed very docile. Speaking of which, that final strike you used to heavily injure Shui, he was pretty good. It was actually able to suddenly flick up when the sword energy was exhausted and directly reverse the situation. What kind of sword style was that to be so handsome? Qin Changxing heard Su Li's question and was very speechless. He thought to himself, could it be that you can't tell what kind of sword style it was? But just like the conversation he and Su Li most often had, he knew that he had to answer. It's the Burning Heaven Sword. When he said these 3 words, he felt very embarrassed, and his face revealed an embarrassed expression. However, Su Li's skin was clearly much thicker than his. He clicked his tongue and sighed in admiration. The person that can create this sword move is truly extraordinary. Qin Changsheng could not continue. He hugged his knees and lowered his head, pretending that he had not heard anything. The Burning Heaven Sword was a secret sword of the Mount Li sword sect. Just like the Golden Crow sword, it was originally a sword style that Su Li had created. He was not willing to speak, so Su Li could not continue to brag. After a moment of silence, his expression became serious. He looked at him and asked expressionlessly, "Why do you know my Burning Heaven Sword?" This was indeed a problem. Cultivation sects had always paid particular attention to not passing on their techniques to outsiders. Anyone who dared to steal would be pursued to death. Moreover, the Burning Heaven Sword was not an ordinary sword technique of the Mount Li sword sect, but a secret technique created by Su Li. The Burning Heaven Sword is recorded in the secrets of the Mount Li sword style. Qin Changxing looked at Su Li's expression and nervously explained. Su Li recalled that before the Great War of several hundred years had ended, before he had finished his apprenticeship, and that he was still an ignorant little boy in the Mount Li sword sect. He had created this absolutely fierce sword style, and in the end he could not resist the requests of his teachers, so he made a copy. He looked at Qin Changsheng expressionlessly and said, "So the secrets of my Mount Li sword style are in your hands." The disciples of the Mount Li sword sect who had experienced the Ivy Festival and the Grand Examination, such as Go Hanshi, Guan Fei Bai, and the others, had long since confirmed this fact. However, Su Li had wandered the world and simply did not care about these matters, so this was the first time they had found out. When he said the secrets of the Mount Li sword style, he stared into Qin Changxing's eyes and enunciated his words particularly clearly and somewhat heavily. Qin Changsheng had studied in Xining Village's old temple since he was a child. After entering the Orthodox Academy, he was also alone, without any teachers or schoolmates. He basically did not have any concept of sex or sects, so he naturally did not know the significance of the secrets of the Mount Li sword style to Mount Li. He nodded and said, "I learned Senior's Burning Heaven Sword from there." Su Li's eyebrows twitched, and he asked, "The secrets of the sword style only recorded the sword manual and the sword paths, but there is no way to circulate the sword essence. It only has the form, but not the spirit. How did you learn it?" Qin Changsheng honestly answered, "I designed 2 paths for true essence to circulate. After some calculations and deductions, as well as 2 moves, the power is definitely not as strong as Senior's true Burning Heaven Sword, but it can still be used." Hearing these words, Su Li was silent for a very long time. Qin Changxing asked, "Senior?" Su Li looked at him and said, "No wonder when I saw you use your sword, I felt it was a little strange. You designed it yourself. When did designing sword paths become such a simple matter? Don't tell me you're actually a true genius of the path of the sword?" Qin Changsheng did not dare to accept it. He said, "That was all Senior's wisdom. I just made some adjustments. Adjustments are sometimes even harder than creating them. I created the Burning Heaven Sword when I was 14, and you changed the Burning Heaven Sword when you were 15. I'm a peerless genius, so don't tell me you're an idiot. To be able to create your own path, to circulate true essence, you're obviously a true genius, even a rare genius that only appears once in 1,000 years. It's just that those true idiots in the capital never discovered this matter that should have been the most important. I'm afraid that even Go Hanshi missed it." Su Li looked at him and said with a face full of praise, "Only those demi-humans whose meridians are different from humans, but whose hearts are set on cultivating the techniques of humans, can roughly understand how important the things you've done are. No wonder the White Emperor couple allowed their precious daughter to take you as her master, and even gave you the secrets of our Mount Li sword style." Qin Changsheng had never felt that he was anything special, other than the fact that he was well-versed in the Taoist canon. That was only because everyone said that Go Hanshi was very extraordinary in the Taoist canon. Only then did he know that he and Senior Yuren were also very extraordinary. Yet today, there was someone who said that he was also extraordinary in the path of the sword and cultivation, even a rare genius. Moreover, the person who said this was a genius that was publicly acknowledged by the world. This made him very shocked, very happy, and also somewhat perplexed. Then he heard Su Li mention the secrets of the Mount Li sword style again, and finally came to his senses. He said, "Senior, the secrets of the Mount Li sword style were given to me by Luoluo, but it's not mine, so I can't give it to you." Su Li saw that he finally understood his meaning, and was just about to smile and extend his hand to receive the secrets of the Mount Li sword style that Qin Changsheng respectfully returned to him, and thus comfort his master's spirit in heaven. Unexpectedly, the situation did not develop like this. He was very angry. He thought to himself, could it be that all those praises and praises I gave you just now were all heard by a pig? Qin Changsheng saw that his expression was not good and wanted to ease the atmosphere. He smiled and said, "Senior can't steal Junior's things." He really was not good with words. This joke was not funny. If Su Li could act now, he would definitely snatch the secrets of the Mount Li sword style from him. Therefore, the atmosphere did not improve at all. Instead, it became even more awkward. "The secrets of my Mount Li sword style were stolen by the White Emperor clan, so I will only take it back from their hands." Su Li looked at him and said. This sentence was said with a heroic spirit that reached the clouds, and the clouds broke the moon. But he knew it was just an excuse or a way out. At this moment, he couldn't even defeat Qin Changsheng, so he couldn't snatch it. He could only not snatch it and leave it for later. The problem was that Qin Changsheng did not know. He thought that Su Li really did think this way. So he curiously asked, "Senior, why haven't you gone to White Emperor City in these past few years to take back the secrets of the Mount Li sword style?" In his view, given Su Li's cultivation and temperament on the path of the sword, since the secrets of the Mount Li sword style had been lost in White Emperor City, Su Li should have long since killed his way over to search for them. Thus, by asking, he had also taken away the steps under Su Li's feet. Su Li's complexion was rather unsightly. He thought to himself that the praise he had given to this little thing was truly inferior to giving it to a pig. That's all for today. I'm going out to party with my friends tonight. I actually want to name this chapter Goddamn Dialogue. Chapter 372. Without a way out, he still had to descend the mountain. After being pushed against the wall by a single sentence, he still had to answer. Su Li looked at Qin Changsheng's eyes that were filled with curiosity and said with an ugly expression, "White Emperor City. I will go there sooner or later." How could the Mount Li sword style remain in the demi-humans? Who would have thought that Bai Xingye would be so shameless that he actually married a wife? Qin Changsheng thought, what does marrying a wife have to do with being shameless? Only then did he understand Su Li's meaning. Su Li sneered, "I'm not afraid of Bai Xingye. If I say I'll fight, I'll fight. But the problem is, after he gets married, if we fight, it'll be 2 against 1. Not to mention anything else, it's too unfair." Qin Changsheng thought, to make enemies with 2 saints, even senior, you would find it troublesome and difficult to handle. Su Li glanced at him and opened his mouth to counterattack. "What's with those swords? Do you have anything you want to say?" In the morning, Qin Changsheng had used the Mountain Sea sword and a few other famous swords, so it was naturally impossible to hide them from Su Li's eyes. He was silent for a while, then told him about the important matters of the Garden of Zhou. He only left out some details, such as the 10 heavenly tome monoliths, the golden-winged Great Peng, and that white-clothed elf girl. "You actually hid so many things from me," Su Li said in a low voice as he looked at him. Qin Changsheng laughed somewhat embarrassedly and said, "Senior, everyone has their own secrets." Su Li mocked, "Only when you can hide a secret until your last breath can it be called a secret. But are you a liar?" Qin Changsheng thought, "Although I'm not good at lying, I still have many secrets that no one knows, not even Senior." For some reason, he actually felt a little proud. Su Li suddenly said without any warning, "From today onwards, I can only rely on you, little guy. So, I changed my mind and decided to teach you a few moves. Don't misunderstand. This is the continuation of the conversation in the snowy mountains. Of course I support Xiushan. I'm just thinking of my own safety." Only now did Qin Changsheng confirm that after blocking Shuehe's blade in the morning, Senior truly did not have the strength to fight. Listening to his explanation, he did not find it interesting, only sad, and also felt the pressure on his shoulders become much heavier. He did not want to see the carefree and unrestrained senior who dared to curse the heavens and the earth become so cautious and cautious. So he wanted the conversation to become more lively. Senior is willing to teach me sword techniques because you value talent. He looked at Su Li and said seriously, because in the battle this morning, I proved that I have the qualifications to learn the sword. Su Li stared blankly, then laughed heartily. Your narcissistic appearance really does have some of my elegance. Qin Changsheng thought to himself, this is all because of Tang 36 influence. Thinking of this, he could no longer suppress his longing for Jingdo and the people in it. It was very strange. After leaving Xining village, he would miss his master and senior Yurun, but he rarely thought of them. However, it had only been a month since he had left the capital, but he thought of the capital more than once every day. Under the great banyan tree in the Tradition Academy, Luoluo was standing shoulder to shoulder with him on the tree. Tang Tang was cursing at the sunset in the lake under the tree. Xin Yuan Po was cooking in the kitchen across the lake. Official Jean was in the distant gatehouse, and Bishop Mei was always asleep. Were they all well? And that young lady Chujian, are you all right? Qin Changsheng was anxious to return. He thought that he had to return alive, and return as soon as possible. He stood up and solemnly bowed to Su Li. He said sincerely, Senior, please teach me sword techniques. Su Li looked at him and asked, what sword techniques do you know? Qin Changsheng stood up and gazed at the gradually darkening lake and the rising stars. He cleared his throat and said, I know Mount Zhong's storm rising pale yellow, 800 swords crossing the river, Orthodox academies toppling mountain staff, unparalleled true sword of the orthodoxy, 13 willow branches, snow mountain sects condense frost. I also know heavenly Tao academies, sword of hithering light, temple seminaries, sword of righteous will, Star Caesar academies, sword of vanquishing army, Wenshui Tang's 3 forms of Wenshui and the Tang family's ancestral sword, Mountly sword sects blossoming like brocade, mountain spirits splitting cliff, law sword, welcoming guest sword, mountain turning sword, burning heaven sword, South Stream temple's 3 lanes of plum blossom, white crane comes from the west, ink great hanging, the lakeside was very quiet. Only the youth's clear and bright voice constantly rang out. The names of countless sword techniques danced on the water with a night wind, and no one knew when they would stop. Only when the numerous stars filled the night sky did someone finally break down. Stop. Su Li looked at him and said, Are you talking about speed recital? Qin Changsheng was confused and asked, Senior, what is speed recital? The storytellers of Lin and City love to do cross-talk, and speed recital is the basic skill they practice. There's one that goes like this. The dishes I make are roasted deer's tail, roasted bear's paw. Hey, why am I telling you this? Su Li was somewhat helpless. He waved his hand and said, Anyway, that's enough. That's enough. What was enough? He had heard enough, and the sword techniques that Qin Changsheng knew were also enough. Qin Changsheng was very obedient and did not continue speaking. He only felt that he had not fully expressed himself. Kid, you know quite a few sword techniques. Su Li looked at him and said, but the expression on his face was not only praise, but also very complicated. Qin Changsheng said honestly, it's all rote memorization. I haven't been able to integrate them, so I don't dare to say that I've truly grasped them. Nonsense. If you want to grasp the true meaning of so many sword techniques, you'd have to start learning them 600 years before you were born. Su Li looked at him expressionlessly and said, and there's also no need. Only those idiots would try to learn so many sword techniques. Qin Changsheng always felt that these words were cursing him. Su Li continued, but this at least shows that you have enough knowledge and experience on the path of the sword. Then what I said today, you should be able to understand and not think that I'm cursing you. Qin Changsheng felt that these words were still cursing him. Su Li did not pause at all, nor did he give any hints. He began to teach. All the experts of the world know that he is not as good as Wang Pa. This morning, he asked me, and you also listened to my answer. He used 7 blades, so no matter what, he couldn't beat Wang Po's 1 blade. This has nothing to do with biting off more than one can chew, nor does it have anything to do with being distracted. It has to do with the essence of the sword. Chen Chongqing asked, "What is the essence of the sword?" Su Li pulled out the heaven-shrouding sword from the yellow paper umbrella and placed it across his knees. Pointing at it, he said, "What character does this look like?" This was the first time Chen Chongqing had closely observed this exceptionally famous sword that had actually followed him for a very long time. He was currently carefully examining it. Hearing the question, he said without even thinking, "It looks like the character one." Su Li solemnly said, "Correct. The soul of the path of the sword lies in one." Chen Chongqing was silent for a while, then said, "But, Senior, didn't you say that the soul of the path of the sword lies in the sword?" Su Li said angrily, "Can we still have a proper conversation? The next chapter might come rather late." Chapter 373. Chen Chongqing originally wanted to say what the soul of the path of the sword was, and how it had anything to do with the spear between Wang Pe and Xue He's blade techniques. But seeing Su Li's angry appearance, he did not dare to say it. He obediently replied, "I can." "Then let's continue. The soul of the path of the sword lies in one." This time, when he said the word one, Su Li emphasized it, so it sounded very much like 100 million. Chen Chongqing earnestly asked for guidance. "You mean cultivating the path of the sword requires wholehearted devotion?" Su Li thought about it, then said, "Yes and no." Chen Chongqing thought about it, then said, "Then is it yes or no?" Su Li stared into his eyes and said, "In short, remember one word as one." Chen Chongqing lowered his head again and said, "Yes." Everyone says that swordsmen are vicious weapons, and only saints can use them. Then, this actually also means that swordsmen are also sacred weapons. Su Li calmly looked at the heaven-shrouding sword in his hand. His right hand gripped the hilt, while the index and middle fingers of his left hand slowly slid across the blade. He said, "Horizontally, the sword is the mountain range on the plains, the chains at the bottom of the great river. Straight, it is the arrows flying high in the sky, the raindrops falling from the sky. Downwards, it will open the earth and reveal the abyss of the yellow springs. Upwards, it will burn the heavens." The reason it's like this is because of its form and because of its intent. The form of the sword is one, and the intent of the sword is also one. Form and intent are one, and the soul is also one. No matter how many sword styles you know, it's still not as good as practicing one sword style to the extreme. Even if you have 10 million swords, you still have to choose one sword for yourself. Su Li looked at Chen Chongqing and said with a deeper meaning. Chen Chongqing seemed to be thinking, and really was thinking. Su Li's view on the path of the sword was actually not new. There were many similar records in the Taoist canon, but they did not conform to his ideas. Su Li said, "Of course, at the very beginning, you still have to learn a bit more and broaden your horizons. Only then can you pick out the most suitable ones and not be dazzled by them. Just like when I was 15, I already knew so many sword techniques that I couldn't even remember their names, which was why I was able to have my later achievements. In short, it's just like looking at mountains and rivers. It's a bit complicated, so try your best to understand it." Chen Chongqing didn't need to seriously experience it to understand the general idea, but this level of teaching was a bit too high. That was a matter for the future, but what should he do now? It had to be known that the assassin was currently hiding in the darkness of the night. Who knew how many strong enemies they would encounter on their way back to the south? And it was even possible that countless people were currently rushing towards them. Su Li looked at him and said, "Speaking of specific battles, your state is rather strange. There's clearly quite a lot of true essence in your body, but for some reason, your output in battle is very terrible." Hearing these words, Chen Chongqing was so impressed that he prostrated himself on the ground. In the capital and the Garden of Zhou, he had been mocked or pitted by many people, saying that his true essence was too thin. Only Su Li could see where his true problem lay. This truly was a very troublesome problem. He thought of Luo and Neng's special innate bloodlines and the power they brought with their boundless true essence in battle, and he felt very envious. It was just that this problem involved the problem of the meridians in his body, so he could not explain it too clearly. He could only silently wait for Su Li's next words. The greatest characteristic of the star condensation realm is the existence of the star domain. If you want to break through the defense, you can either use a higher cultivation to directly suppress it, or use sword energy to crush it, or use a sufficient amount of true essence to forcefully attack a single point. Your cultivation is not enough, and the amount of true essence you can output through your sword techniques is not enough. Even if your sword is sharp enough, you still can't enter the world of others. Su Li glanced at Chun Changsheng's dagger and said, "It's a good thing that most of the star condensation experts on the continent are just in name. Their star domains are still very far from being perfect, so they all have weak points and flaws. If the opponent does not move, perhaps they can use their cultivation and aura to cover up those weak points and flaws, but as long as they move, they will definitely be seen through. So what you need to learn the most right now is how to see through the weak points of a star condensation opponent." Chen Changsheng thought of the battle in the morning and said, "Just like how seniors saw through Shuehe's flaws." "Correct, but if you really wait until the opponent moves and then see through it, it will often be too late. So according to your current cultivation, the best method is to calculate ahead of time. Even if you have to guess a few positions as backup. How do I calculate? Age, cultivation, physical strength, body condition, most likely move, characteristics of the star domain, amount of true essence, background of the sect, cultural inheritance, characteristics of the region, eating habits, marital status, number of children." "Senior, what does marital status have to do with the number of children?" "Married people will naturally have weaker courage, and their physical strength will also be weaker." "What about the number of women?" "If they've just given birth, that person will definitely be brave and hard to defeat because they have too much love and reluctance to part with this world. If they've already given birth to 7 children, that person is also very scary because it's extremely likely that they don't fear death. If that's the case, being married for too long is also extremely scary. You're a typical summer bug. What's scary about that kind of opponent? You're probably thinking about suicide every day." "Senior, can we talk about some serious matters? Don't make trouble for no reason." "Who's making trouble for no reason?" Su Li was indeed not making trouble for no reason. He had listed out 67 specific matters for Chen Changsheng. Whether it was age, cultivation, physical strength, body condition, sect background, or skin color, they were all significant in battle. According to what he said, if Chen Changsheng could truly learn this sword style, then he could very easily see through the flaws of a star condensation opponent. This sword style did not have any moves, nor did it require much true essence or cultivation. It only required intelligence and powerful calculation ability. It could give the wielder a pair of all-seeing eyes that could see through the world, so it was called the intellectual sword. The night was long and the stars were in the sky. Su Li used the sword as a brush, writing and drawing on the ground by the lake. He explained to Chen Changsheng the relationships and changes between these seemingly unrelated matters. Chen Changsheng gradually accepted the explanation regarding the intellectual sword. He listened very earnestly and attentively, his thoughts constantly turning, unwilling to miss a single word. After concluding the explanation of the intellectual sword, Su Li lay down between the 2 furry deer and began to sleep. Chen Changsheng sat by the lake. He did not sleep because he could not sleep. In front of his eyes was a dense mass of characters and an extremely complex process of calculation. He was good at rote memorization, but his ability in this aspect was truly very ordinary. Without sufficient intelligence, how could he learn the intellectual sword? He simply had no way of grasping this seemingly simple but actually extremely complex sword style. Just at this moment, he suddenly thought of that Lady Chu Jian. In front of him, there seemed to be a white dress drifting on the surface of the lake. If it were her, with her outstanding talent in calculation and deduction, learning this sword style, she would probably be able to learn it very quickly. Chen Changsheng's current calculation ability is very ordinary, but his greatest advantage right now is that his database is large enough to store enough information. This month is the new year, so the updates will definitely be heavily affected. During the New Year period, there will definitely be a vacation. Everyone knows that this month, the number of updates will exceed 80,000. Yes, in March, there will be a lot of updates. In addition, as for who is first on the ranking of assassins, some friends are very concerned, so let's have a contest on WeChat. There will definitely be people who can guess it. Haha, I can only use these two words to express my current mood. Chapter 374. If one viewed the intellectual sword as a question, this question had too many initial conditions, too many parameters, and too much information. Even confirming it was extremely difficult, not to mention calculating the final result. Chen Changsheng confirmed that he could not complete this sort of calculation, at least not in the middle of an intense battle. He even began to doubt whether anyone could complete this sort of calculation. However, Suli had already proven in the battle in the morning that he could at least do it. Suli was obviously not an ordinary person, but if he could do it, it meant that this matter could be done. The night lake and the distant mountains were right in front of him. He very quickly shook off his discouraged and fearful mood. He thought about how he could memorize all the directions of the Yesher step and use them. Even if he did not have the talent to calculate and see through people's minds, he might still be able to use this stupid method to reach his goal. If he did not have time to calculate in battle, then he would first do countless questions until he could turn this sort of calculation into instinct. Perhaps he could really save some time. But how could he do countless questions in advance? If he returned to the capital, it might be possible, but where could he find so many star condensation experts to fight? And even if he could not solve those questions, would he be killed by his opponent? He noticed that there were countless specks of light in the night lake in front of him. Those were the reflections of the stars. He raised his head and gazed at the night sky. He saw the countless stars on the pitch-black curtain, quietly looking at him. Humans, divine race, are the world's most complex research subjects because they have different levels of intelligence, different life experiences, and their emotional changes and mental activities are more in a random state. As a result, the final objective appearance that they present is all different, is incomparably complex, and only our vast starry sky can compare. Many years ago, the most knowledgeable pope, who had made the greatest contribution to humanity's knowledge, sighed at the starry sky. It was recorded in the ancient records of the Orthodoxy. In that era, there was also a demon scholar, Tongus. When he traveled south to Snow Pass and saw the sky full of stars, he also said similar words in shock. Looking at the starry sky, Chen Changsheng thought of these words. He sensed the red star that belonged to him in the distance, invisible to the naked eye. Then he raised his right hand and pointed at a certain region of stars in the night sky. From there, he plucked a star chart and placed it in front of his eyes. Of course, this was just an image, not something that actually happened. On the last night of viewing the monoliths in the Mausoleum of Books, he combined the lines of the 17 monoliths of the front mausoleum together, forming a star chart. It was the one before his eyes. This star atlas was only an extremely small part of the entire starry sky, but there were hundreds of millions of stars on it, emitting either bright or dark rays of light in front of his eyes. It seemed solemn, eternal, and motionless, but he knew that these stars were moving at every moment. Every star represented a condition. A moving star meant that the star was undergoing change. For example, the growth of age, the exhaustion of physical strength, the decline of courage, and the gradual emergence of the desire to die. If the traces in the starry sky represented fate, then the changes in these stars represented the changes in many factors that determined fate. The combination of the orbits of the stars was destiny. Everything was within it. Even the star domain of a star condensation cultivator could not surpass this range. The movement of the stars was like the movement of qi. The brightness of the stars was like the strength of qi. Any condition, any information could be simulated by the orbits of the stars. However, those conditions were more realistic and not as mysterious. Or, to put it simply, those conditions could be calculated and observed. If one could see the vast starry sky in a concise manner, If one could find a way out from the sky full of stars, then one could naturally find the weak point of a cultivator's star domain. However, the stars were moving, and the many factors that made up a cultivator's body were also constantly changing. Then how could one obtain the final and clear result? It did not take long for Chen Changsheng to understand. Just like this star chart, the position of a star did not mean that the star would always be there. Instead, in hundreds of millions of years, it was the place that it most often appeared. This was a question of probability. A star was most likely to appear at a certain place, so it was there. A sword would most likely stab at a certain place, so it would stab at a certain place. A star domain would most likely change, however, it was most likely to change. This was very difficult to clearly describe with words, but he understood. Then he began to solve the problem for the first time. The first time he cultivated the intellectual sword, he did not slash at a star condensation opponent, but at the entire starry sky. He calmly gazed at the starry sky, countless streams of light flashing through his bright and clear eyes. Each stream of light was a condition, or perhaps a parameter. He earnestly recorded everything before his eyes, then calculated until he was entranced. At 5 a.m, Chen Changsheng opened his eyes. He did not sleep for the entire night. The positions of the countless stars were gradually branded into his sea of consciousness, and those extremely complex calculations made him consume countless amounts of spiritual sense and energy. Yet for some reason, he did not feel tired. As the morning breeze caressed his face, he even felt somewhat refreshed. He had already touched upon the true meaning of the intellectual sword. Of course, he was keenly aware that he was still many nights away from truly grasping the intellectual sword. Suli leaned against the warm body of the furry deer. He looked at him with some surprise, and then began to laugh. In the following nights, Chen Changsheng continued to observe the starry sky and polish his intellectual sword that had not even taken its embryonic form. Suli did not give him any more instructions. Every night, he slept very soundly, but he purposefully slowed down the speed of his journey south. Suli was keenly aware that he was currently at a very crucial moment. If he really could grasp the intellectual sword, then when he faced off against star condensation opponents in the future, he might really be able to catch them off guard and obtain victory, so he would rather sacrifice a bit of speed. Yes, whether it was Su Li who had passed on the sword or Chen Changsheng who had learned the sword, they had always limited the opponents they could encounter on the journey south to star condensation. This was because cultivators below the star condensation realm were basically no match for Chen Changsheng. And if the opponent really was above the star condensation realm, those old monsters of the Saint realm, what meaning was there in sharpening the sword just before the battle? If the situation continued to develop like this, perhaps in another few dozen nights, Chen Changsheng really might be able to borrow the starry sky to wash and polish his intellectual sword into shape. Regretfully, this world could not give the heavily injured Su Li so much time. Even more regretfully, Chen Changsheng's opponent had finally appeared. Before the battle, no matter how one looked at it, there was no time for the meticulous work of sharpening the sword. There were still tens or even thousands of nights before Chen Changsheng would be able to create the intellectual sword. On a certain day in the middle of spring, on a barren mountain 200 miles away from Tianliang County, an extremely bewitching man appeared. The man wore lipstick and wore a dancing dress. He looked just like a dancer. In short, he was just like Xue He from a few days ago. No matter how one looked at him, he did not seem like an assassin. Chen Changsheng asked in confusion, why did they not seem like assassins when they appeared? Or is it to say, to become an outstanding assassin, one must not look like an assassin? Is this the creed of an assassin? The creed of an assassin? What nonsense are you talking about? Su Li said mockingly. Do you think they would be happy to appear with such a ghastly appearance? It's just that they came in such a hurry that they didn't have time to change their clothes. Apologies, the update is a bit late. Recently, my time and energy have really been a bit too much. Tomorrow's update will definitely be very, very late. Chapter 375. Other than those Avengers who were determined to die, no one dared to kill Su Li. This was because everyone in the world knew that they could not defeat him, so they naturally could not kill him. Thinking about it, killing him would only bring disgrace upon oneself, bring about one's own death. There was no other conclusion. But now, the situation had changed. He had been besieged by the devil race for several days and nights, and even though he had luckily escaped, he was still seriously injured. For those who wanted to kill him, this was undoubtedly the best opportunity, and an opportunity that must be seized. When Shui found out that Su Li was heavily injured, he had been patrolling the military stronghold in the lower city. Before he had even taken off his armor, he had been pushed around by several of his subordinates to drink quite a bit of wine. While his face was red and his ears were hot, he suddenly received this news. Without even thinking about it, he flipped his hand and threw away the nightlight, splashed some wine, and knocked out 2 officers who still wanted to urge him to drink. Riding the red cloud Qilin, he charged into the snowy plains. He only thought about finding Su Li as quickly as possible and then killing Su Li. How could he care about anything else? Now, the man who appeared in the barren mountain was the same. For days ago, he had been in the estate of Xuanyang City singing an opera to entertain himself. He had invited the best troupe in Lanling City, and only a few of his closest and most powerful guests were present. He was singing the famous Spring Night song, playing the part of a charming and pleasant bride. Just as he was singing excitedly, his eyebrows flying and his eyes softening, he suddenly saw the bishop sitting below him give him a meaningful glance, and soon after, he heard a message. Su Li was heavily injured, so he might be in the north of Tianliang County. He sucked in a breath of cold air and squinted at the sky, his eyes filled with indescribable contempt and sorrow. After a few moments of silence, the only thing that could be heard from the stage was the clattering of a board. He leaped off the stage, kicked off his cloud boots, threw away his headscarf, seized the lightning horse of the Xuanyang City Guard, and then left the city, galloping straight to the county's north. Qin Changxing had said that they did not seem like assassins because they had never been assassins. Moreover, it was just as Su Li had said. They were in a hurry, and they were very afraid that they would not make it in time. Something like Su Li being heavily injured might not happen even once in his entire life. So how could he have the time to change clothes? Thus, Shui's armor shone brightly, while the man's dancing clothes fluttered in the wind. He still had remnants of makeup on, and was wearing his usual clothes. Of course, he didn't look like an assassin. Shui's bright armor was covered in dust, and this man's dancing clothes were also covered in mud. His expression was a bit tired and haggard, and the red makeup that had not been completely blown away by the wind gave him a bewitching and charming feeling. As he looked at Su Li, his eyes grew brighter and brighter, and the smile on his face grew thicker and thicker. Lifting his sleeve to cover his lips, he was extremely charming, extremely proud, yet there was also a pain that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. After so much trouble, I finally found you. It really wasn't easy. However, thinking about how you're going to die by my hand soon, no matter how much trouble I put in, it's nothing. To be able to meet you in the 3,000 li of northern plains, I have to say that my luck is pretty good. Hearing these words, Su Li also felt somewhat sorrowful. He said to Qin Changxing, "Your luck is really good. You just happen to need an opponent stronger than you, but not by too much, and now one has appeared." With his eyes, he could easily tell that this man was at the initial level of star condensation. The man slightly raised his eyebrows and said with some surprise, "You don't know who I am?" Qin Changxing nodded his head honestly. The man lightly lifted his sleeve and softly introduced himself. "I am Liang Hongzhuang." Liang Hongzhuang was famous. In Tianliang County and even the entire northern continent, he was very famous because of his family background, because of that elder brother of his, because many people knew that he liked to sing, liked to dance, and because he was very strong. Qin Changxing and Su Li looked at each other, still not knowing who he was. Regarding the Taoist canon, Qin Changxing could recite it backwards, but regarding the real world of cultivation, he was truly ignorant and inexperienced. As for Su Li, there were very few people on this continent that required him to remember their names. It was very clear that Liang Hongzhuang had not reached that level. Without a doubt, this was an extremely great humiliation. Liang Hongzhuang frowned, but he did not get angry. He sighed, "It hurts my pride a little, but if I can kill Sir Su, perhaps even more people will know my name." Chun Changsheng said, "Could it be you came to kill people just to become famous?" Liang Hongzhuang did not answer, only smiled. Su Li suddenly asked, "Liang from Liang Wang's son?" Liang Hongzhuang's expression became slightly solemn. "Liang from Liang Hongzhuang." When Su Li heard this, he understood why this deranged fellow wearing a red wedding dress wanted to kill him. He turned to Qin Changsheng and said, "He really wants to kill me, so you have to kill him." Qin Changsheng heard this short conversation. He did not completely understand it, but he could roughly guess something. This assassin wearing a red dancing dress presumably had some relationship with Liang Wang's son. Seeing Liang Hongzhuang get closer and closer, seeing the ribbons of the dancing dress gently swaying in the wind, his brain quickly turned, incessantly observing, analyzing, and calculating, attempting to find a flaw in the dancing dress. To defeat your opponent, you first had to understand your opponent. Whether it was the intellectual sword or the most ordinary of battles, they all had this requirement. He did not know who this dancer called Liang Hongzhuang was, but he knew of Liang Wang's son. Liang Wang's son was an expert ranked extremely high on the Proclamation of Liberation, a true celebrity. What kind of celebrity could be called a true celebrity? If even an ignorant and inexperienced fellow like Chun Changsheng had heard of him, then he was a true celebrity. Chun Changsheng did not have a very good understanding of the sex of the cultivation world, but he had a very good understanding of the Liang clan. Because the Liang clan was the former imperial clan, their cultivation, lifestyle, and bloodline inheritance were all recorded in the ancient records of the orthodoxy. Liang Wangsuan's luxurious and extravagant style, Liang Wangsuan's techniques, Liang Wangsuan's style of swordsmanship, Liang Wangsuan's attitude towards Wang Pe and Xiao Zhang, Liang Wangsuan's age, Liang Wangsuan's 3 wives. Countless fragments of information floated up from the bottom of his sea of consciousness in an extremely short amount of time, then quickly flashed before his eyes. Just like the myriad stars in that region of stars, they arrived before his eyes from the night sky and began to twinkle. He wanted to find the most crucial blank space in these stars, that passage. "Can it work?" Su Li asked. Chun Changsheng shook his head. His intellectual sword had not yet been sharpened. No. It should be said that the sword billets had not even taken shape. It was simply impossible to see through the flaws of a star condensation cultivator. So how could it be used against an enemy? Even if you can't see it, you still have to guess. "Senior, since you can, why can't you guide me like last time?" "I said it before, in order to block Shuehe's blade, I used up all the strength I had saved up. If you want to see through the star domain, do you need strength? Or else, I always feel that it doesn't make sense. Wait until you have the chance to be so tired that you can't even open your eyes. Only then will you have the qualifications to understand this principle." "Fine, then what do we do next? If I say so, then guess it." "Guess." "That's a guess." As he spoke, Liang Hongzhuang had already arrived in front of the two. Qin Changsheng could no longer care so much. His dagger left its sheath like a bolt of lightning, stabbing towards the other end of the fluttering belt. On a distant hillside, 2 furry deer were currently eating grass with their heads lowered, not even glancing in their direction. "Apologies, I'll only write this chapter today. I'm too busy. 2 chapters tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow, I'll return to Hubei. I'll be flying for an entire day, so I'll take a day off." Regarding the intellectual sword, there's one saying that it's Dai Zongfu, and another saying that it's by Qi. Those who understand will understand, and those who don't, I recommend everyone to read Jin Yang's novels and Tale of Charm. I only found out in the last 2 years that there are actually many young friends who have never read Jin Yang's original works. Regarding this, I express my deep anxiety. Also, in Charm, I like by Qi the most. Chapter 376. To the furry deer, the battle between Chun Changsheng and Liang Hongzhuang was not as attractive as the grass. If there were other spectators, they would probably think the same, because there was a great disparity in strength between the 2 sides, and because the last of Su Li's strength had been used to block Shuehe's blade. But for some reason, the only spectator present, Su Li, was completely focused on the battle, not even blinking. Liang Hongzhuang was dressed in red dancing clothes, ribbons fluttering around his body. The chi of a star condensation expert danced with him, traveling everywhere. This was a complete, even perfect domain. It was impossible to see any flaws. Chun Changsheng could not see it. But just like what Su Li had said to him at the end, even if it was a guess, even if it was a wild guess, he still had to do it. He still had to gamble. Of course, since it was a guess, since it was a wild guess, there was no hope of winning the gamble. The only advantage he had was that he was not like other ethereal opening cultivators who had no understanding of the star condensation realm. Back in the Orthodox Academy, when he thought that he had failed in purification, he had actually succeeded. When he thought that he did not dare to enter meditative introspection, he was actually already guiding starlight into ethereal opening. When he was viewing the monoliths in the front mausoleum, he had folded the lines of the heavenly tome monoliths into a star chart. This method was originally star condensation. He was an anomaly in the cultivation world, forever cultivating through methods that surpassed his current cultivation level. In other words, on the path of cultivation, he did not walk faster than others, but he could see further. He knew what star condensation was. Cultivators guided starlight into purification, meditative introspection, transformed star radiance into true essence, and then borrowed the power of the starlight to open the door to ethereal palace. What they needed to do next was to continue guiding starlight into their bodies, lighting up the stars on the spirit mountain, matching those stars with their own acupuncture points, stimulating their true essence, drawing their own star chart, reconstructing the miniature world in their bodies. Externally, that was the star domain. The star domain was the world of star condensation cultivators. It was the projection of the starry sky in the cultivator's body and sea of consciousness. The true starry sky was tranquil and eternal, solemn and dignified. According to common cultivation knowledge, the star domain of a star condensation cultivator should also be perfect, without any flaws. Even the nothingness that cultivators of higher cultivation could see through was not true nothingness. But because the cultivator's cultivation was limited, they could not perfectly control their spiritual sense and true essence. Chen Changsheng did not believe this. He believed that there was no such thing as a perfect star domain, because the real star domain was not a perfect and unchanging existence. It was because the real star domain was a dynamic equilibrium. Since it was a dynamic equilibrium, once an external force was introduced, this equilibrium would be broken at a certain moment. It sounded like Su Li had used to guide him in breaking Shui He's blade domain, but in his Li's blade. This Su Chen's Dao had even surpassed Su Li's sword domain. It was just that right now. Neither Su Li nor he himself knew just what he had understood, just what he had discovered. Naturally, he could not imagine just what sort of changes this Dao domain would bring to his future cultivation and battles, and even the history of the entire world of cultivation. Seeing Liang Hongzhuang's dancing clothes, countless fragments of information flashed through Chun Changsheng's sea of consciousness at high speeds. He incessantly calculated and sensed the qi attached to those ribbons, as well as the abnormally distinct ripples of true essence in the barren mountain. It was like he could see countless stars appear before his eyes. No one could clearly see the relative positions of these stars in such a short amount of time. And even more so, no one could calculate the laws of movement in this star domain through the brightness and relative positions of these stars in such a short amount of time, and thus find the weakest point in this star domain. The ability of humans to calculate had a limit. At this time, it was necessary to give way to those abilities that did not have a limit. For example, intuition. Of course, it could still be called guesswork. The several hundred stars were bright and dark, changing colors in his sea of consciousness. They clearly did not move, but he seemed to see those stars move. Humans were the combination of all relationships. Fate was the general theory of the trajectories between humans. The starry sky was the canvas that described and explained everything. Liang Hongzhuang's person was constantly changing. With each passing year, He aged at a rate of 1 year. With each additional jar of strong alcohol he drank, he became slower and slower. With each passing moment, he became more and more pained. Thus, his star domain was naturally also constantly moving. The stars moved, the brightness changed, and a new painting was born. Faintly, in that star domain that was densely packed with stars, he suddenly saw a patch of darkness. The surrounding stars seemed to turn into a path, and that patch of darkness was the end of the path. He did not know where it led to, but it might be nothingness. Chun Changsheng did not know what it was, and he could not be sure if what he saw was real or not, because in this star domain there were many similar places. But at this moment, he could only believe in himself. Even if it was a guess, he had to believe it to be true. He thrusted his sword towards that position. There was a soft swish. The slightly cold air in the barren mountain was pierced. The red ribbon fluttered incessantly. Chun Changsheng's sword was clearly about to stab into the ribbon, but it mysteriously disappeared and then reappeared somewhere else. Su Li's expression turned slightly cold, his sword-like eyebrows slightly raised. Such a fast sword. It was actually able to break through Liang Hongzhuang's star domain. Such a fast sword. Liang Hongzhuang actually did not have any reaction. A clear whistle rose up from the mountains. Liang Hongru hurriedly retreated, only stopping when he was more than 10 zhang away. The red ribbon slowly floated down, falling at his feet. His left ear had been studded with a pearl. At this moment, that pearl had already disappeared, leaving behind only a dark red bead of blood. Chun Changsheng's sword had pierced his left ear, piercing that pearl. Liang Hongzhuang raised his hand and touched his left ear. His hand was slightly wet, and he frowned at Chun Changsheng. Besides shock, he was also very confused. He was actually able to break through his star domain. Just who was this youth? Surpassing levels to fight wasn't something inconceivable, but most of it happened between cultivators of the same level. For example, a cultivator at the lower level of ethereal opening could attempt to challenge a cultivator at the upper level of ethereal opening. But meditation challenging ethereal opening challenging star condensation, this kind of challenge that surpassed an entire level was extremely rare. Even in the tens of thousands of years of history, there weren't many successful cases. Of course, there would definitely be exceptions, such as those geniuses with extraordinary bloodlines. When Xiushan Jun was still at ethereal opening, which cultivator at the initial stage of star condensation dared to say that they could definitely defeat him? Another example would be when Chun Changsheng left the capital. Luo hadn't reached ethereal opening, but which cultivator at ethereal opening, including him, dared to say that she was inferior to him? But Chun Changsheng clearly didn't have any special bloodline. His true essence was very ordinary, and his aura was also very ordinary. Liang Hongzhuang suddenly thought of a possibility and asked, "Could it be that you are?" Chun Changsheng clasped his sword in greeting and said, "Orthodox Academy, Chun Changsheng." The next chapter will be slightly later. I have to pack my luggage, send a cat back to my parents' home, and celebrate the little new year. Oh, I almost forgot. I wish everyone a happy little new year. Chapter 377. Liang Hongzhuang's expression slightly shivered, his extremely thin eyebrows that had been drawn raised upwards. The youngest principal of Orthodox Academy, the object of the Orthodoxy's nurturing, the Pope and Archbishop Meili Shah's most favored junior. So was this youngster. He knew of Chun Changsheng. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to guess. But there were a few things that he couldn't understand. For example, Chun Changsheng reaching the upper stage of ethereal opening at the tender age of 16. Even his distant cousin, that he wasn't very close to, felt it was inconceivable. He also greatly admired him, but he couldn't understand Chun Changsheng's previous strike. Everyone knew that Chun Changsheng's talent lay in Xiuxing, in the perseverance, diligence, and comprehension hidden in the 4 words, "thoroughly read the scripture of the way." But his bloodline talent was very ordinary. It couldn't compare to Xiushan Jun, Suyu Rong, and Her Highness Luo. Then, how could his sword strike surpass the boundary between ethereal opening and star condensation, and directly break through his star domain? Could it be that he had already seen through her dancing clothes before he had attacked? Liang Hongzhuang gazed at Su Li. The star domain of the star condensation realm seemed perfect, but in the end, it was not truly perfect. However, only a powerful expert on Su Li's level could see through it. But previously, Su Li had not made a sound, and his gaze had always been on Chen Changxing's sword, not on Liang Hongzhuang. What kind of sword did you use? Liang Hongzhuang looked at the short sword in Chen Changxing's hand, his thin eyebrows raised even higher, becoming even more bewitching. Chen Changxing did not know how to answer this question. When Su Li had taught him the sword, he had said very clearly that this sword style should be counted as part of the intellectual sword, but he had always felt that there was a faint difference between the two. At this time, Su Li also asked a question. He looked at Chen Changxing and asked with a confused and doubtful expression, "You really guessed it?" Chen Changxing nodded and said honestly, "I guessed." Su Li's eyes lit up, as if it was the first time he had seen this youth. He continued to ask, "Probability?" Chen Changxing calculated in his mind and said uncertainly, 7. Su Li's voice suddenly grew louder. 70%. Even though his talent in the path of the sword was unparalleled in the world, he still felt that this answer was far too shocking. Whether it was several hundred years ago when he was learning the sword at Mount Li, or when Xiushan Jun first learned the intellectual sword with him, neither of them had been able to accomplish this feat. This was impossible. Yes, so it can happen. Chen Changxing was a little embarrassed and said in a low voice, "I said 7%. Su Li thought to himself, this is more like it. Even so, Chen Changxing's performance had already exceeded his prediction. He sighed and said, "Enough. At least you've left the category of guessing and arrived at guessing." Chen Changxing was confused and asked, "What's the difference between guessing and guessing?" Su Li said, "Guessing requires evidence. Guessing is blindly messing around, so of course it's different." Chen Changxing thought back to the feeling he had in the moment before he attacked with his sword. He suddenly couldn't tell if he was guessing or just guessing. His sword didn't rely on calculation, but intuition. Most of the time, intuition was an instinctive reaction produced after a lot of calculation and practice. He faintly felt that his attack, the way he had broken through Liang Hongzhuang's dancing dress, was slightly different from the intellectual sword that Su Li had taught him, but he did not know what this difference was. Liang Hongzhuang stood over 100 feet away, watching the conversation between the two of them. He suddenly laughed, his beautiful face, which still had remnants of makeup, filled with ridicule. "You're already chatting?" Su Li looked at him and said, "You want to talk? Let's go together then." Liang Hongzhuang stared blankly, not expecting to hear this sort of answer. After a moment of silence, he actually really did join in the conversation. This was because he had some things he wanted to say to Chen Changxing. As for Su Li, he had nothing good to say. He looked at Chen Changxing and said, "Why did you appear in the north of Tianliang County? Why did you travel with this demon? Why do you want to help him?" In the capital, the impression Chen Changxing had of Su Li was, for the most part, the image of the junior martial uncle of Mount Li, an unworldly expert. In this journey of 10,000 li, he realized that this impression was not accurate, or perhaps it was not enough to describe it. Su Li himself had admitted that he had killed many people, but this was the first time he had heard someone so directly denounce Su Li as a demon. Do you know how many people he's killed? Do you know how many times his sword has been bathed in blood for it to be so sharp? Liang Hongzhuang looked at Chen Changxing and said with slight ridicule, "He's killed so many people, he should have died long ago, but he still hasn't died. The cycle of the heavenly Tao and retribution has arrived. Now, he has finally welcomed the day of his death, but you still want to protect him?" Chen Changxing said nothing, because he did not know what to say. Liang Hongzhuang straightened his dancing clothes and walked over again. "He's a southerner, and you're a Zhou. He's killed so many Zhou people, so what reason do you have to help him?" This did not seem like a problem, but in reality, if one carefully thought about it, it truly was a problem. On the snowy plains, Chen Changxing had carried Su Li on his back as they fled. It could be said that he was repaying Su Li for saving his life, and only Su Li could help him return. But now, After traversing 10,000 li of the snowy plains, no matter how many times he had saved his life, he had already repaid him. Now that he had returned to the Great Zhou, he could completely safely leave. Mount Li was strong because of Su Li, and the people of the Orthodoxy were strong because of the Orthodoxy. Right now, Su Li was like a heavily wounded lion in distress. And as long as the Orthodoxy was not destroyed, with Chen Changsheng's status as the principal of the Orthodox Academy and the rumored appreciation of him by the Pope and Archbishop Melisha, who would dare do anything to him? As long as he was willing to leave, whether it was Shui He, Liang Hongzhuang, or those experts that would come later, they would all immediately send him back to the capital. No matter how one looked at it, there was no reason for him to continue standing at Su Li's side. Chen Changsheng glanced at Su Li. Su Li's expression was indifferent. He did not say anything, because this was also a question that he had always wanted to understand. It was just that he did not ask, so Chen Changsheng naturally did not answer. Now that Liang Hongzhuang had asked, he wanted to hear just what Chen Changsheng's answer was. Chen Changsheng was silent for a while, then said, "I inexplicably arrived in front of Xiulao City from the Garden of Zhou." Liang Hongzhuang slightly raised his brows. He had not expected it to be like this. When I was in the Garden of Zhou, I thought I was doomed. When I left the Garden of Zhou and saw that Xiulao City, I also thought I was doomed. Then, Senior Su Li saved me, and I also thought that Senior being surrounded and killed by the demons might have something to do with that plot I encountered in the Garden of Zhou. Fine, it's actually not that complicated. The reason is actually very simple. Senior saved me, so I naturally could not watch him die. Chen Changsheng looked at Liang Hongzhuang and seriously explained. Su Li said, "Your life has long since been repaid for the 10,000 li of snowy plains and Shui He's blade. Senior, accounts can't be calculated like this. To be more precise, there's no way to calculate accounts for things like lives." Chen Changsheng clearly understood his own intentions, and his words also became more fluent. "To Senior, you only saved my life, but to me, this life is all I have." Su Li and Liang Hongzhuang understood the meaning of these words, but as people who had lived in the world of cultivation for many years, their bodies and minds were all dust, it was very difficult for them to accept this sort of reasoning. Su Li shook his head. "I believe that you no longer owe me anything." Chen Changsheng said, "I don't think so." Su Li was a little taken aback. He was very clear that Chen Changsheng wasn't an admirer of his, and they didn't share the same interests, let alone a friendship despite the difference in age. That was why he was curious as to why Chen Changsheng didn't leave. Only at this moment did he realize that it was because of such a simple reason. Of course, a person who could persist in such a reason was truly not simple. A life in the eyes of others is actually all you have. Then how are you prepared to repay me? Don't tell me you're prepared to guard me for the rest of your life, to be my ox or horse. Su Li looked at him and said with slight ridicule, but his eyes were somewhat warm. Chen Changsheng said with slight embarrassment, "There's no need to be like this, right?" Su Li began to laugh, and Liang Hongzhuang also began to laugh. One was gratified, one was ridiculing, each with different meanings. Even if we really wanted to settle accounts, saving each other once could cancel it out, I still don't believe that it's already been repaid. Chen Changsheng looked at Liang Hongzhuang and said, "I want to repay the debt of saving my life, so I have to confirm that Senior is truly safe and that his life is not in danger before I can leave. It's just like a sick person on his last breath in the water. If you save him from the river, but ignore his illness and leave just like that, how can it be considered as you saving him?" Liang Hongzhuang thought it over, then said, "That's reasonable." Chen Changsheng said, "Many thanks for your understanding." Looking at Liang Hongzhuang's face that was as beautiful as a woman's and his red dancing clothes, he really did not know how to address him. Liang Hongzhuang looked at him and calmly said, "I want to avenge my father's death. Is that not also very reasonable?" Chen Changsheng was silent for a while, then nodded. Revenge for one's father's death was a reason that no one could refute. It was the highest reason. "Since you insist on saving him, then I can only kill you," Liang Hongzhuang said. "After this, even if His Holiness the Pope condemns me. It's only death that settles it. You know that I'm not afraid." Chun Chang Sheng knew that to this kind of person who sought revenge, once they made up their mind, the dignity of the orthodoxy would not be able to change their minds. He said, "I understand." Liang Hongzhuang's qi grew more and more severe. Without the ribbons, his dancing clothes gently fluttered in the mountain wind. His star domain was even more stable and powerful than before. He looked at Chun Chang Sheng expressionlessly and said, "Do you have any last words?" Chun Chang Sheng sincerely said, "I hope that Your Excellency will be lenient. Tomorrow I have to fly for an entire day, so I have to seize the opportunity. Seize the opportunity to ask for a day off. Of course, the opportunity here is very bitter. I wish everyone a happy new year." The last sentence of this chapter is the best. Chapter 378. Liang Hongzhuang had rushed over thousands of li to find Su Li for revenge. He had said very clearly that this was the death of his father. Since this was the case, this battle would not be decided by victory or defeat, but by life or death. Before a battle of life and death, he asked his opponent to be lenient, and in such a sincere manner that it was not just words, but a request from the heart. Qin Changxing's words were truly surprising. Liang Hongzhuang did not know how to respond, so he shook his head. However, what happened next was not surprising at all, because there was no such thing as leniency. The red dancing dress fluttered in the blue, barren mountain, and the dust and earth within several hundred li were all shaken into the sky. Liang Hongzhuang floated over, like a real ball of fire, about to start a prairie fire. It was hard to find anything in the world that could spread faster and more violently than fire. Could this young man see through his domain? I was so fast that I couldn't even see clearly. So how could you see through it? Logically speaking, with Liang Hongzhuang's cultivation and reputation in the north, he should not have needed to use this kind of method against an ethereal opening cultivator. However, Chun Changsheng was not a normal ethereal opening cultivator, and in order to kill Su Li, Liang Hongzhuang was even willing to endure humiliation. Of course, he did not care about being a little more cautious, even if it was a completely unnecessary caution. For a star condensation cultivator to be so cautious when facing an opponent clearly weaker than himself was a very frightening thing. Seeing the red dancing dress that burned the barren mountain like a flame, Su Li's sword-like eyebrows rose again, but his expression became a little more indifferent. This indifference was indifference to life, indifference to the end. He could already see the end of this battle. Qin Changsheng had previously injured Liang Hongzhuang's earlobe with his sword, but he had no way of dealing with the current situation. Several hundred years ago, when he last left the Garden of Zhou, he was already at the peak of ethereal opening. Even at that time, when facing the current Liang Hongzhuang, he could not think of a better way to deal with him other than exchanging a kill for a kill. What could Qin Changsheng do? Qin Changsheng did not know what to do. No matter how high his comprehension was, no matter how diligent he was in cultivation, the difference in cultivation levels still existed. Moreover, in terms of battle, Liang Hongzhuang's experience was far greater than his, and it came too quickly. It was very difficult for anything to be more violent and faster than an encroaching fire. His ethereal opening realm cultivation simply had no way of keeping up with Liang Hongzhuang's speed, but he had two things that were faster than Liang Hongzhuang: the Yesher step and the speed of thought. With a single movement of his divine sense, he could cross thousands of mountains and rivers. He looked at the dancing costumes that covered the mountains and plains like fire, thinking hard. The old events of the previous dynasty recorded in the Taoist canons. The characteristics of Liang Wangsun's method of rampaging through the north, Liang Hongzhuang's callous gaze, his terrifying red sleeves, his explosively rising qi, his boundless true essence, the angle at which a blade of grass would bend after being stepped on, and countless numbers or descriptions appeared in his sea of consciousness. Then, they constantly combined and matched with each other, forming an extremely complex star chart. His intellectual sword had yet to form. Even if he was given another 3 days and 3 nights, he would not be able to calculate the weak points of Liang Hongzhuang's star domain, nor would he be able to clearly see the connections within this star atlas. And after a while, Liang Hongzhuang's dancing clothes would burn him to ashes. He could only guess, no guess. Suli had said that guessing and guessing were different. Guessing was a blind guess, but when guessing, one had to keep one's eyes open, look at the world, look at the starry sky, have a basis, and then listen to one's intuition or the feeling in one's heart. He made his own guess, and then took the initiative to move. There was wind in the barren mountain, all coming from Liang Hongzhuang's dancing clothes, but the area around Chun Changsheng was very quiet, strange, and terrifying. Suddenly, he disappeared from his original position. In the next moment, he was in front of Liang Hongzhuang. He used a simplified version of a Yesher step. An extremely bright and beautiful sword glow lit up the barren mountain, accompanied by a low chant, carrying with it a solemn and terrifying pressure that seemed to originate from ancient times. It pierced into the flames that covered the mountains and plains. He used the new generation of the Dragoncry sword. Compared to the powerful domain of Liang Hongzhuang's dancing clothes, his sword intent was not powerful, but it was especially awe-inspiring. The sword glow suddenly illuminated the mountains and plains like a bolt of lightning. The dagger moved at an unimaginable angle, straight and abruptly turning, bypassing the flames that filled the sky and arriving in front of Liang Hongzhuang. A clear howl that was filled with anger and shock resounded through the mountains and plains. Liang Hongzhuang hastily retreated. Even though he was in midair, one could clearly see that a clear sword mark had appeared on his left shoulder. Fresh blood seeped out from that sword mark. Chun Changsheng's sword had actually once again pierced him. The intensity of the fire didn't decrease. Instead, it increased exponentially. Liang Hongzhuang was enraged to the extreme. A red dancing robe descended from the sky, enveloping Chun Changsheng within. At this moment, another brilliant sword flash appeared. The sword chimes continued to resound throughout the mountains and plains, but it was not hurried, one after another, even a little slow, and the sword intent was not very strong. Yet the dancing clothes that were like fire were unable to descend, unable to envelop Chun Changsheng. Time was advancing between the sword glow and the dance of fire. After an unknown amount of time, a terrifying tearing sound suddenly resounded through the barren mountain. The flames that covered the mountains and plains suddenly disappeared without a trace. The sword glow also did not continue to light up. The two figures separated, facing each other in the mountains and plains, separated by a distance of several tens of feet, a light mountain breeze brushing past between them. Chun Changsheng's face was very pale. The hand that held the sword couldn't stop trembling. Liang Hongzhuang's face was even paler, his entire body covered in blood, and his dancing clothes had already been completely shredded. Chun Changsheng had struck out 7 times, but not once had he missed. At this point in the battle, victory and defeat had already been decided. The remnants of makeup and drops of blood were especially clear on Liang Hongzhuang's pale face. Fresh blood constantly dripped from his tattered dancing clothes. He stared at Chun Changsheng, his eyes wide open, as if he could not understand just what had happened. Chun Changsheng was somewhat at a loss. Even at this moment, he still did not really understand just what had happened. Suli looked at Chun Changsheng, his emotions somewhat complex. A youth at ethereal opening against a famous person at star condensation. It ended with the former's victory. In the history of the cultivation world, a rarely seen surpassing cultivation levels to kill had just happened before his eyes. In the past, he had accomplished surpassing cultivation levels several times. He believed that Xioshan, who had learned the sword from him for a month, could also do it when he was at the upper level of ethereal opening. However, the fact that Chun Changsheng could accomplish such a thing, as well as the method he used, still made him very shocked. This battle was so ordinary and mediocre. Suli understood that it was only because it was ordinary and mediocre that it was even more soul-stirring. Chun Changsheng had not relied on his innate talent or bloodline, not on the heavenly way of the sword, not on the gift of the heavens and the starry sky, but on his own hard work and comprehension. This was not a genius, but it was far more powerful than a genius. In the long river of time, in the vast continent, had such a person ever appeared before? Suli looked at Chun Changsheng, silently thinking about this question. His fingers lightly tapped the yellow paper umbrella. Until the end, he had only tapped it 6 times. Yesterday, I ran around for an entire day. Not to mention being tired, the old problem with my waist came up again. All sorts of laziness and squeamishness. I really want to rest for another day. In the end, when I looked at the calendar, I discovered that today is 213. To me who has written Jiangyi for almost 3 years, this really is an extremely important day. No matter what, I have to write some of it. As a result, there's this chapter. 7 swords, 6 umbrellas, exactly 13. Tomorrow is Valentine's Day. I will definitely update. I won't give little kids the chance to make mistakes and spend more money. Chapter 379. Liang Hongzhuang looked at Su Li, his face expressionless, as if he was a dead man. He asked what? Silence. No one could answer this question. He smiled bitterly and said, I thought that the laws of heaven would always come in cycles. It's not that I won't avenge you. It's just that it's not time yet. It's just that it's a little late, but there will always be a result. Who would have thought that there's no such thing as the heavenly Tao? Why can a person like you live so well? Now that you're about to die, another person like him pops up. Chun Changsheng lowered his head and didn't look at him. The hand that held the short sword slightly trembled. How exactly did our Liang clan offend you? What benefits did the Tian Liang Chun clan give you? More than 10 years ago, you wanted to exterminate my Liang family. Liang Hongzhuang's laughter grew louder and louder. His blood flowed faster and faster, and his voice grew more mournful. By the time he finished speaking, the question had already turned into a roar. It was the roar of an injured beast. It was filled with rage, unwillingness, despair, and pain. It directly pierced into the deepest part of the soul of the person who heard it. Chun Changsheng lowered his head even more, his face even paler. His hand trembled more and more, as if he would not be able to hold onto the hilt of his sword in the next moment. He did not want to look at Liang Hongzhuang, who was already in a state of madness, and he also did not dare to look at Su Li. This was because he was very worried that if he were to look at it, he would feel irrepressible regret for what he had done, and thus fall into pain and struggle. Hearing Liang Hongzhuang's sorrowful and indignant questioning and seeing Chun Changsheng with his head lowered, Su Li still remained expressionless. What had already happened could not be changed, so whether or not he regretted, it was meaningless. There was no need to reflect on it. Even if there was, it could only happen in his heart. He absolutely disdained explaining anything to the world. This was the kind of person he was. If it was in the past, no matter how miserable Liang Hongzhuang was, he would leave without batting an eyelid. Today, his expression did not change, but for some reason, he said a few words before leaving. Or was it because Chun Changsheng's head was hanging too low and his hand holding the sword was shaking too much? How many people and clans did your Liang clan's ancestors kill in the south when they were emperors? Su Li looked at Liang Hongzhuang and said expressionlessly, as for exterminating your entire Liang clan, if I really wanted to do that, how could you still be alive today? How could Liang Wang's son still be alive? His mood suddenly became a little irritated. He looked at Chun Changsheng and said coldly, Why are you standing here and not leaving? Imitating loneliness or pretending to be desperate? Don't think that you have the right to lecture me just because you saved my life. After saying this, he walked towards the barren mountain. After a few days of recuperation, he was still heavily injured, but he could walk slowly. The 2 furry deer ate their fill of grass and returned to the field. Seeing Su Li walking off into the distance, and Chun Changsheng still standing with his head lowered, they seemed somewhat perplexed, not knowing who to follow. Chun Changsheng raised his head and looked at Liang Hongzhuang. He wanted to say something, but in the end, he only said 2 words, sorry. He finally said these 2 heavy words, but his mood didn't become a bit more relaxed because of this. He reached out to grab the reins of the 2 furry deer's necks, silently chasing after that somewhat lonely figure. On the other side of the barren mountain was the south. Liang Hongzhuang could no longer support himself and fell to the ground. Looking at the two gradually leaving, he yelled in pain, "Do you really think you can return to the south? If you continue to follow him, you will also die." Shang didn't turn his head back. He lowered his head and continued walking silently. Su Li walked very slowly. It didn't take long for Liang Hongzhuang to catch up. The furry deer bent its front knees and prostrated itself on the ground. He helped Su Li up. From start to finish, there was no conversation. After passing through this barren mountain, they crossed over two other barren mountains. The furry deer stopped by a grassy slope that was as green as a carpet. Shang dismounted from the back of the deer and rushed to the side of the road. He bent down and began to vomit. Su Li looked at him and said mockingly, "That guy didn't die, so what's there to vomit about?" Shang waved his hand. He wanted to explain, but he couldn't suppress the discomfort in his chest and began to vomit again. This battle with Liang Hongzhuang was the first time he had directly and single-handedly defeated a star condensation expert. If this battle were not so ordinary and unremarkable, so understated, perhaps it would have been even more worthy of its place in history. However, the price he had paid was not ordinary. A battle of surpassing cultivation levels was naturally not as understated as it seemed on the surface. Under the pressure of Liang Hongzhuang's star domain, he had also suffered very heavy injuries. All the bones in his body felt like they were about to split apart. Previously, his body had been trembling the entire time. That was because of his emotions, but also because his body really could not hold on any longer. However, the true injuries were not in his body, but in his mind. He did not have Su Yorong's talent in calculations, nor did he have a sufficiently powerful bloodline. He had only just started on the path of learning the intellectual sword, and now he had to forcefully use the intellectual sword to meet the enemy. Moreover, he had to use 7 swords in one move. This was not something he could currently endure. The large amount of information that could even be described as a sea, or even as vast and boundless as the starry sky, directly squeezed out all his mind, causing his sea of consciousness to tremble until it was on the verge of collapse. His spiritual sense had been completely consumed by those 7 swords, and his sea of consciousness had become empty. The body of a cultivator was a boat in the sea of consciousness. Right now, his sea of consciousness had dried up. That boat was constantly falling in the empty space, forever without end. This was a very terrifying process. He felt that everything around him, the barren hills and grassy slopes, were constantly spinning and changing. The azure sky seemed to be currently falling over his head. This made him feel incomparably vexed, uncomfortable, dizzy, painful, and weak. It was like he had continuously drunk wine for 7 days and 7 nights. That wine was strong wine, and even bad wine. This sort of feeling was extremely painful, extremely uncomfortable. Moreover, this was a matter of the mind, and there was simply no way to expel it from the body. He vomited out all the roasted meat and wild fruits he had eaten last night and this morning, and he also vomited out his stomach juice. In the end, all that was left was something that looked like clear water. Even when he could not vomit anything out, he still did not stop. He began to retch, as if he wanted to vomit until the seas dried up and the rocks crumbled, until the end of time. Only by doing this could he express his attitude towards this world. Su Li looked at the youth vomiting on the side of the road and said nothing. After some time, he used the yellow paper umbrella as a staff and slowly walked behind Changsheng. He slowly raised the yellow paper umbrella and struck the back of Changsheng's neck. With a thud, Changsheng slowly fell to the ground. Before he collapsed, he used the last of his strength to ensure that when he fell backwards, he would not be stained by the filth that he had vomited out. However, he did not faint. His eyes were still open, looking at the sky. He was in incomparable pain and extremely weak. Su Li indifferently said, "If you're not willing to faint, there's a chance that you'll go crazy." In that strike, just now, he had used up all the strength that he had secretly accumulated over the past few days. He originally thought that it might not be enough to kill the enemy, but it could be used to save someone. However, he did not think that this youth's body would be so tough. Chen Changsheng opened his mouth like a fish on the verge of death. He weakly said, "Senior, there's a blade of grass on the mountain. You're not thinking of writing a poem before you die, are you?" Suli said, "Don't be like this. It makes people uncomfortable." Chen Changsheng raised his hand with difficulty and pointed at the blade of grass. "That's the 100 days intoxication." Just as Suli had said, if he continued like this, his sea of consciousness really might rupture, and he might directly die or become an idiot. Moreover, the most crucial thing was that right now, he really was in a very uncomfortable, very painful state. If he could guarantee that his vision would not be blurry right now, that he could clearly see the white clouds and the blue sky, he would definitely remove the needles at the first moment and knock himself out. However, he could not do it. Fortunately, when he fell, he saw a blade of grass that could knock him out. Suli understood what he meant. He plucked the blade of grass and somewhat roughly tore it into pieces with his hands, stuffing them into his mouth. Chen Changsheng finally closed his eyes. His face was still pale, and his eyelashes trembled slightly. Suli breathed a few times tiredly, then sat down cross-legged. He glanced at the silent and uninhabited barren mountain, and his right hand rested on the handle of the umbrella. After a while, Chen Changsheng suddenly opened his eyes and looked somewhat absent-mindedly at the sky. Suli's eyelids drooped slightly. "Still not willing to faint?" Chen Changsheng said tiredly. "The medicinal effect isn't that fast." Suli said, "Then shut your mouth, close your eyes, and wait." Chen Changsheng said with difficulty, "But I have something I want to say to Senior." Suli was silent for a while, then expressionlessly said, "Release. Senior, in the future, it's better if you kill less people." After saying this, Chen Changsheng felt that he had finally done what he had to do. His mind relaxed, he closed his eyes, and fell asleep. Little friends, a holiday is a good thing, but you must take proper precautions. Don't let anyone die. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow, I want to strive to write over 4,000 characters. Chapter 380. Looking at the unconscious Chen Changsheng, Suli slightly raised his eyebrows, as if deep in thought. This was because of the last sentence he had said, and also because of the many things Chen Changsheng had said and done in the past few days. In his long journey of traveling the 4 seas for several hundred years, he had seen many outstanding youths. Some of those youths were geniuses, and some were extremely determined. The youths he admired the most were all currently in the Mount Li Sword sect. However, he had never seen a youth like Chen Changsheng. He had always thought that youths would always have a youthful spirit. The so-called morning sun and morning dew, new butterflies and fledglings, the aura of youthful life was so clear and impassioned. Chen Changsheng also had this sort of temperament, but it was even more indifferent. This youth was also a gust of spring wind, but the wind of early spring was very light, so fresh and refreshing that it made people feel relaxed and happy. Suli gazed at the sleeping Chen Changsheng in silence, carefully observing him. Normally, when a youth was awake, they would often intentionally lower their voice and pretend to be calm and unhurried, so as to obtain the praise of their elders and the admiration of their peers. And when they were asleep, they would return to the appearance of their true age, revealing their innocent and pure side. However, Chen Changsheng was not like this. His eyes and brows were the eyes and brows of youth, as clear and childish as the tea garden before the rain. However, his expression was still as calm as when he was awake, and even somewhat sorrowful. Why was it that even in his sleep, this youth's brows were still furrowed so tightly? What was he thinking? What was he worried about? What was he worried about? If his body always bore a pressure that he could not escape from even in the land of dreams, then why was it that when he was awake, he was so calm and unhurried that no one could feel it at all? Suli was very clear that there was definitely something in Chen Changsheng's heart, but he did not want to ask, nor did he want to investigate. It was not that he was not curious, but because there were more important things to do. He raised his head to look at the boundless wilderness. His face was expressionless, his eyes like stars, and the chill gradually increased. The hand that gripped the yellow paper umbrella was slightly looser than before, but it was a more suitable posture for drawing a sword. The assassin called Lu Qing was currently in the middle of this barren wilderness, and he should be watching this place. The third rank on the continent's ranking of assassins was undoubtedly very frightening to a normal person, but under normal circumstances, it was not enough to make Su Li raise his head to look at him. It was just that the current situation was not normal. Chen Changsheng was unconscious, and he was heavily injured. No matter how one looked at it, this was the best opportunity for the assassin to strike, unless the assassin decided to continue reciting the doctrine of conservatism. Su Li was suddenly rather nervous, so the expression on his face became even more indifferent. It had been many years since he had been this nervous, because it had been many years since anyone could threaten his life. He had thought that he had long since seen through life and death, but after Xue He and Liang Hongzhuang appeared, he realized that even with his sword-hard illumination, he still could not continue to maintain clarity of mind in the face of death. Perhaps it was because he had just experienced the most difficult test of life and death. In his life, he had encountered many tests of life and death and defeated countless enemies that seemed undefeatable. Compared to those opponents, people on the level of Xue He and Liang Hongzhuang were not even worth mentioning. However, he was keenly aware that the moment he had been closest to death in his life was not in the snowy plains outside Xiulao City, nor was it by the cold stream in the longevity sect. Rather, it was not too long ago in that nameless mountain when Liang Hongzhuang's dancing clothes were like fire as he threw himself at him. The reason why that was the moment he had been closest to death was because Liang Hongzhuang would definitely kill him, because Lu Qing was definitely hiding nearby. The most important reason was that he had no way of grasping his fate in his own hands. Whether it was outside Xiulao City against the shadow of the Demon Lord and the tens of thousands of demon soldiers, or in the cold stream against the 10-odd elders of the longevity sect with unfathomable cultivation, he had a sword in his hand, and he could swing it. As long as he had a sword in his hand, the world was Su Li's. Even if the god of death stood before him, he would not fear it. But in that moment, he could do nothing. He could only entrust his fate to this youth called Chen Changsheng. Fortunately, this youth had proven that he was very trustworthy. This time, I really do owe you a life. Su Li shook his head as he looked at the faintly creased brow of the sleeping youth. The assassin was still hidden in the wilderness. For some reason, he still did not make a move. Perhaps it was because Chen Changsheng's performance or identity made him feel some fear, or perhaps it was because Su Li's hand had never left the handle of the yellow paper umbrella. At dusk, Chen Changsheng finally woke up. His face was as pale as snow, and his eyes were not as clear and bright as they usually were. It was like he had a hangover. Fortunately, his sea of consciousness had finally calmed down, so there should not be any danger. He looked at Su Li, but before he could say anything, Su Li expressionlessly said, "What do you want to say?" After a moment of silence, Chen Changsheng said, "As a junior, I do not know the story behind the events of the past, so it's hard for me to judge right and wrong. Perhaps Senior really did not kill wrongly, but as a son, taking revenge for his father is not wrong. If there is nothing wrong, but you still want to kill, then there must be something wrong with this matter." Su Li said, "As expected, you're still preaching." Chen Changsheng said, "On the snowy plains, Senior always said that you're not a good person because you've killed too many people. From this, it can be seen that Senior also knows that killing too many people is not a good thing, so why not change?" Su Li's eyebrows twitched, and he said with a smile that was not a smile, "But when did I say that I wanted to be a good person? Since you don't want to be a good person, then why change and kill less people?" Chen Changsheng was speechless and said somewhat helplessly, "Senior, why is there a need to strive to be first in everything, to argue everywhere? 100 barges vying for the current, wanting to argue but forgetting to speak. If you don't argue, then what kind of life is that?" So he said it very calmly and calmly. Chen Changsheng was silent for a very long time. Ever since he woke up, he had always been reading. After knowing that his body was not good, he thought about how to live a little longer. He felt that life was really the best thing in life, that living was the most beautiful thing. He very rarely thought about how to live. He thought about it, and then no longer continued to think about this question. He understood that in terms of his view of life, he was a youth in the countryside who could not even eat his fill, while a person like Su Li had eaten fish and meat every day for many years. Now, he began to pursue a light and healthy diet, searching for the meaning of inheritance and spirit in food. They had never been people of the same world. This did not mean that he had any conflict or antipathy towards the people of that world. On the contrary, he was very envious of the people of that world, because the people of that world were the majority of the people of this world. Living was originally supposed to be like that. At the very least, it was more meaningful than the way some people lived. That Mount Li disciple called Liang Xiaoxiao, the things that Chun Changsheng encountered in the Garden of Zhou, the things that he was willing to talk about, had already been told to Su Li for the most part, and he had also told him about Liang Xiaoxiao. It was just that a few details by the lake had only been completely filled in today. In his view, since the gate to the Garden of Zhou had reopened, as long as Qi Jian and Zhixiu were still alive, Liang Xiaoxiao would definitely have already been punished. It was just that after experiencing the battle with Liang Hongzhuang, he was somewhat sensitive to the surname Liang, so he had mentioned it for Su Li's consideration. However, he had not imagined that Su Li's reaction would be so great. Hearing that Liang Xiaoxiao's sword had pierced Qi Jian's abdomen, Su Li's complexion darkened. It was as if a torrential rain was gradually gathering between his brows, and he could send out several bolts of lightning at any time. Finally, Su Li said, "He will die." Qin Changsheng thought to himself, "That's your Mount Li's business, and he really did deserve to die." However, he had not imagined that that damnable Liang Xiaoxiao had already died, and had even used his death to leave behind so many troubles. Su Li had already guessed why Liang Xiaoxiao would collude with the demons, but this matter involved Mount Li's clean reputation. Crucially, it involved the two bloody cases that he had single-handedly caused in the longevity sect in the north, so he was not willing to say too much to Qin Changsheng. Just how did you see through it? He turned to Qin Changsheng and asked. This question was naturally asking what method Qin Changsheng had used to see through Liang Hongzhuang's star domain. If the first sword was a guess, then what about the other 7 swords? Every sword did not miss, so it was naturally impossible for it to be a guess. Could it be that he had already learned the intellectual sword? Qin Changsheng very carefully thought it over. After confirming the situation at the time, he said, "It really was a guess." Su Li obviously did not believe it, but from his expression, it definitely did not seem fake. Most importantly, Qin Changsheng had no reason to deceive him. And most importantly, Qin Changsheng really did not have any reason to learn the intellectual sword so quickly. To be able to guess which star in the sky would move was already an extremely inconceivable matter, and to be able to guess the hole in the star domain of a star condensation cultivator was even more unimaginable, let alone him guessing 7 times in a row. If you really relied on luck, then your luck is already so good that it's not just luck. Su Li looked at him and said, "You are a person with great luck." Qin Changsheng did not understand. He asked, "Luck, what is the most important thing in cultivation? Willpower? Comprehension?" Su Li shook his head. "No, it's luck. Any expert that can dominate a region in the end, the so-called saints, are all people with extremely good luck. Because of this, they can escape danger so many times. Of course, luck is only for a moment, while luck is for a lifetime. So they are all people with great luck, including me." Qin Changsheng thought it over, then asked, "What determines luck?" "Of course it's fate." Su Li looked into his eyes and said, "So in other words, your fate is very good." Hearing this, Qin Changsheng actually had nothing to say in response. From the moment he was born, he had been considered to have a bad fate. Who would have thought that now he would actually be said to have a very good fate? This made him feel somewhat absurd, somewhat comforted, and also somewhat sad. Continuing south, the 2 people and the 2 deer finally neared Tianliang County, and their learning of the sword also reached a new stage. After experiencing that battle with Liang Hongzhuang, Chen Changsheng was very clear on where his current weaknesses were. First of all, he needed an even more powerful spiritual sense and willpower. He understood why Su Li had said in advance that only after experiencing it would one have the qualifications to know that using the intellectual sword required sufficient strength, because the intellectual sword required even more extraordinary energy, or else the person using the sword would not be able to endure that tremendous amount of calculations and would probably faint before the sword could even strike. Secondly, if he wanted to defeat a star condensation cultivator, he needed to increase his own output. Only like this could he seize that fleeting opportunity and directly deal a heavy blow to his opponent, thus avoiding the situation where 8 consecutive strikes were not able to kill Liang Hongzhuang. It must be known that that situation was truly very dangerous. If Liang Hongzhuang had been just a little stronger, able to endure a little longer, Chen Changsheng would have collapsed from the shock to his sea of consciousness, and he and Su Li would have undoubtedly died. As a result, at dusk, by a stream, Su Li began to teach him a second sword style. Your output of true essence is too terrible, just like a child holding an embroidery needle. No matter how fast you are, even after stabbing 3,600 holes in your opponent's body, you still won't be able to stab your opponent to death. So a few days ago, I thought of a sword style. Su Li looked at Chen Changsheng in the stream and said, "Do you want to learn it?" Chen Changsheng did not answer, because this sort of thing did not need to be answered, as long as it was a sword user who would not want to learn the sword from Su Li. Not to mention that this sword style was very clearly designed by Su Li for him. Moreover, he was currently very shocked. Looking at the middle-aged man by the stream, he opened his mouth, unable to say anything for a long time. According to these words, did it not mean that on that day when he discovered that there was a problem with his output of true essence, Su Li had begun to ponder this problem, and then in just a few days he had designed a completely new sword style? What was a true genius? What was a grandmaster of the path of the sword? That was it. Su Li acted like he did not see him and continued to speak. He seemed to calmly introduce this newly created sword style. As for whether or not he was somewhat proud in his heart, one could tell a little from his slightly raised eyebrows. This sword style was called the blazing sword, and it still only had one move. To be more precise, it was a method of using the sword. If the intellectual sword was said to help the swordsman see through the weakness of a star condensation expert, then the blazing sword was said to help the swordsman explode with his sword energy and true essence, allowing him to obtain an enormous boost in a short period of time. Through this, he could deal even greater damage to a star condensation opponent. The two sword styles that Su Li had taught him were both very specific, as if they were specially designed to help him pass through the body. Chapter 381. What Chen Changsheng said was not accurate. At the final moment of the grand examination, he had only prepared to use the final move of the Mount Li sword style, but had not truly used it. However, the key to the final move of the Mount Li sword style was the intent. Go Hanshi had seen through his intent and left the stage, so it was not wrong to say that he had used that move. Su Li was very clear on what the final move of the Mount Li sword style meant, so he felt that he could not understand this youth more and more. However, since Chen Changsheng understood this move and had used it, the final difficulty of learning the blazing sword no longer existed. The blazing sword was a sword move and also a method of circulating true essence. It was a method that Su Li had created for Chen Changsheng through his observations of him in the past few days. The amount or efficiency of a cultivator's output of true essence depended on the speed at which star radiance was burned and the width of the meridian channels. There was a certain upper limit. The higher the talent, the better the aptitude, the faster the speed at which star radiance was burned and the speed at which true essence could be transmitted. For people with innate bloodlines like Su Yurong and Qiu Shanjun, there was no need to consider the limitations of meridian channels. As long as there was enough star radiance in their bodies, they could even endlessly output true essence. The amount of star radiance in Chen Changsheng's body was not small, and there was no problem with meditative introspection. The The greatest problem was that the true essence channels were too narrow, and there were even many meridians that were broken, so the efficiency of true essence output was naturally extremely low. As a grandmaster of the path of the sword, Su Li's most extraordinary aspect was that his understanding of the world far surpassed the scope of ordinary people. His methods of solving problems were very unexpected, but in reality, they were the most reasonable. He did not put his finger on the amount of true essence Chen Changsheng had, nor did he attempt to solve the problem of his meridians. Instead, he used a fearless method to directly place his hopes of solving the problem on the method of burning star radiance. Of course, the one who needed to take the risk was Chen Changsheng, and the one who needed to be fearless was still Chen Changsheng. There are many methods or forms of burning. Normally, it pays attention to being neutral and gentle, melting the star radiance into clear water, dripping with your thoughts. Only like this can the thin water flow for a long time. However, this move requires you to use an even more violent method to burn your true essence. Su Li looked at him and said, "It's like countless wood shavings sealed in a space." Suddenly, a source of fire appears, and those wood shavings will almost simultaneously ignite, releasing an extremely great heat and might, just like an explosion. Chen Changsheng listened to his words and imagined the scene in his sea of consciousness. He nodded. Su Li said, "The method of explosive combustion can help your true essence instantly rise to a certain level, breaking through those messy meridians of yours. From there, the lethality of the strike can be barely seen." "I understand," Chen Changsheng said, "but what does this have to do with the last move of the Law Sword?" Su Li looked into his eyes and said, "Countless amounts of true essence are burning in your body at the same time, like an explosion. It's possible to illuminate the planes through the sword energy and dazzle your opponent's eyes, but it's even more likely to directly burn you into an idiot or explode you into pieces. If you don't have the determination to die, it's impossible to complete that final step." Chen Changsheng could feel that the black dragon's spiritual soul within the dagger was faintly reacting, remembering the scene of him performing meditative introspection in the underground cavern of New Northbridge. He couldn't help but feel a little emotional, thinking to himself that everything that had happened before had a meaning. Thinking of Su Li's reaction when he said that he knew the last move of the Mountly sword style, he resisted the urge to tell Su Li that he had many similar experiences. Although he was young, his attitude towards life and death was already very experienced. Su Li carefully explained the moves and sword intent of the blazing sword, then said no more, letting Chen Changsheng comprehend it on his own. Afterwards, he gazed at the mountains in the twilight, at the green grass on the other side of the stream, and said nothing. That assassin was very likely in that patch of grass. Chen Changsheng was not in a hurry to comprehend the sword. He smeared coarse salt on the fish he had cut up, then hung it over the fire and began to roast it. Since he had confirmed that the enemy had always been there, the bonfire was no longer a problem worth paying attention to. Accompanied by a slight burning smell, he followed Su Li's gaze to the green grass on the other side of the stream. After a while, he shook his head, thinking to himself that the assassin was truly extremely patient. He had actually followed them for so many days without making a move. Perhaps Zheshio could do it, but he definitely could not. To him and Su Li, that assassin that had always been hiding in the mountains was an extremely great pressure. The two of them were very clear that at some point, that assassin would definitely appear. It was just that they did not know when. Just like Senior said, if you keep waiting like this, even if you wait until you die, you won't get any chance. Chen Changsheng said in his heart to that famous assassin that he had never met, "Because Senior is teaching me how to use the sword. I will become stronger and stronger, and when that time comes, you won't be able to kill us." After a very simple but delicious dinner of fat and tender white fish and sorghum rice, Su Li leaned against the furry deer and closed his eyes to rest. Chen Changsheng finished tidying up, then walked to the stream and sat down, formally beginning to comprehend the sword. He gazed at the green grass on the other side of the stream and thought about the 10,000 li of snowy plains in his body. That snow was the star radiance that he had gathered day and night. It was the initial form of true essence, and it was the source of all battle energy. Right now, he only needed to use his spiritual sense to completely ignite the snowy plains, and even the lake water that enveloped the spiritual mountain above the snowy plains, transforming it into an endless stream of energy and spirit. But this sword demanded that he not do this, because that method of combustion was still too gentle, not fierce enough. The speed at which star radiance was transformed into true essence was too slow. The blazing sword was based on the word burn. It had to be violent, decisive, and burn the body with fire. Chen Changsheng sat by the stream in silence. He watched the twilight gradually recede, watched the numerous stars cover his eyes, all the way until the morning light once more arrived. He used an entire night's time to finally learn how to use his spiritual sense to descend on the snowy plains, but not to ignite the snowflakes. Instead, he used that incorporeal energy to make the snowy plains even more fluffy, until the snowflakes left the ground and once more danced in the sky. The morning sun came out. The red glow covered the mountains and fields, and the stream water was completely red. Looking at the green grass on the other side of the stream that seemed to be burning, Chen Changxing's hand slowly left the hilt of his sword. On the third day of learning the blazing sword, Chen Changxing and Su Li encountered the third assassin on their way back south in a tea house on the side of the official road. This assassin was called Li Pingyuan, a tyrant of the north. He had countless deaths sworn under his command, and it was said that this person had some unclear connections with the Bear Man tribes that had secretly defected to the demon race. Perhaps it was precisely because of this that he was able to more accurately determine Su Li's route to the south than anyone else, and waited here for their arrival. Because this matter was too important and at the same time too urgent, the tyrant of the north, Li Pingyuan, had only brought a dozen or so of his most loyal subordinates. However, in this small tea house, it was already rather crowded. There were no customers in the tea house, and the faint smell of blood wafted through the air. The stove used to boil, tea was already cold, and it seemed like it had not been lit for many days. The owner had probably died long ago, but it was unknown where his corpse had been buried. Chen Changsheng sat by the tea table, gazing at the tea in his bowl that had a strange smell. He said nothing, and it was impossible to tell what he was thinking. "Congratulations." Su Li looked at him and said, "Killing this person, I trust that you won't have too much of a psychological burden. The next chapter will be very, very late, so late that it's hard to imagine, but it will definitely happen.